Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. It was a quiet evening, and I was alone in my suburban home. I had just settled on the couch with a cup of tea, planning to catch up on some reading. The neighborhood was calm, as usual, and I found the silence comforting. The sun had just set, and the last light of the day was fading away. As I looked out the window, I noticed a car parked across the street. It was a dark sedan, not unusual by itself, but something about it felt off. The car had been there for over an hour, and I hadn't seen anyone get out. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe someone was just visiting a neighbor. I tried to focus on my book, but my eyes kept drifting back to that car. It was still there, engine off, no movement. My unease grew, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to get up and close the curtains, hoping that would help me relax. Just as I was about to pull the curtain, I saw a man in the driver's seat. He was staring directly at my house. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped back, hoping he hadn't seen me looking. I peeked again, just to make sure. He was still there, eyes fixed on my home. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he was just lost or waiting for someone. But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my gut. I decided to keep an eye on him for a while longer. I turned off the lights in the living room, hoping to observe without being seen. Minutes turned into an hour, and the man didn't move. I could barely see him in the dim light, but I knew he was still there. My anxiety grew with every passing minute. I debated whether to call the police, but what would I say? That a man was sitting in a car, doing nothing? Suddenly, he got out of the car. He was tall and wore a dark hoodie. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him walk slowly toward my house. I ducked down, my heart pounding. He reached the sidewalk and then stopped, just standing there, looking at my front door. I crawled to the hallway, trying to stay out of sight. I grabbed my phone, my hand shaking, and dialed 911. I whispered to the operator, explaining that a man was outside my house, acting suspiciously. They assured me that an officer would be on the way. I heard a noise from the front porch. It sounded like someone trying the door handle. Panic surged through me. I ran to the back of the house, looking for a place to hide. The sound of the door rattling grew louder, more urgent. He was trying to break in. I hid in the pantry, closing the door as quietly as I could. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast. My phone was still in my hand, and I texted a friend, letting them know what was happening. The silence in the house was deafening, and I strained to hear any movement. The front door creaked open. He had gotten inside. I covered my mouth, trying to keep my breathing quiet. I could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate, as he moved through the house. He was searching for me. The footsteps grew closer. He was in the kitchen now. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find me. The pantry door handle turned, and I froze. The door opened a crack, but then I heard a loud knock at the front door. The man stopped, hesitating. The knock came again, louder this time. It was the police. I heard the man curse under his breath and then footsteps running away. I waited, too scared to move, until I heard the officer's voice calling out. I slowly came out of the pantry, shaking but relieved. The officer was at the front door, and I rushed to open it. I told him everything that had happened, my voice trembling. He took my statement and assured me they would patrol the area. The police searched the neighborhood but didn't find the man. They promised to keep an eye on my streak for the next few nights. I was shaken but grateful that the officer had arrived when he did. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump, and I kept checking the windows, expecting to see the man again. The next day, I had security cameras installed around my house. It helped a little, but the fear didn't go away. For weeks, I was on edge, always looking over my shoulder. I never saw the man again, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I moved to a different neighborhood a few months later, hoping to find some peace. But I still can't shake the feeling of being watched, and every dark car parked on the street makes my heart race. I decided to take a solo camping trip in the Appalachian Mountains. I had been looking forward to it for months. The idea of getting away from everything and being surrounded by nature was appealing. I packed my gear, checked the weather, and set off on a Friday morning. The drive was long but scenic, and I felt a sense of peace as I left the city behind. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon. There were a few other cars parked there, but it was mostly deserted. I double-checked my map, strapped on my backpack, and started hiking. The trail was steep and rocky, but the views were worth it. By the time I reached my intended campsite, the sun was starting to set. I set up my tent in a small clearing and built a fire. I cooked a simple meal and sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of birds. It was perfect. After a while, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of voices. At first, I thought it was just a dream, but then I heard it again. Low, muffled voices, not far from my campsite. I sat up, my heart racing. I unzipped my tent just a little and peeked out. There were 3 men standing by the edge of my campsite, talking quietly. They were dressed in camo and had rifles slung over their shoulders. I stayed as still as possible, hoping they would leave. But then one of them pointed towards my tent, and they started walking closer. I scrambled to get my flashlight and shone it in their direction. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sorry to bother you," one of them said, stepping forward. "But you're on private land. This is our hunting territory." I apologized and explained that I had checked the maps and this area was supposed to be public land. They didn't seem to believe me. The one who spoke before, who seemed to be the leader, stepped closer and looked down at me. "Maps can be wrong," he said. "You need to pack up and leave. Now." There was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. I nodded and said I would leave first thing in the morning. But he shook his head. "No, you need to leave now." I started packing my things, trying to stay calm. The men stood there, watching me. I felt their eyes on me the whole time. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. They had guns, and I was alone. I just wanted to get out of there safely. Once I had everything packed, I put on my backpack and turned to leave. The leader stepped in front of me. "We'll walk you out," he said, his voice low. It didn't feel like an offer. It felt like a threat. They walked behind me as I made my way back down the trail. The forest was dark, and my flashlight only illuminated a small circle in front of me. The men didn't use flashlights. They seemed to know the trail well enough. Every now and then, I glanced back and saw their shadows following me. After about an hour of walking, we reached a point where the trail split. The leader stopped and pointed down a narrow path. "That way will get you back to the main road," he said. "Don't come back." I nodded and turned to go, but then I felt a hand grab my arm. I spun around, and one of the other men had me by the wrist. "Wait," he said, looking at the leader. "Maybe we should make sure he doesn't come back." Panic surged through me. The leader looked at me, then back at the man holding me. "Let him go," he said finally. "He'll get the message." The man released my wrist, and I stumbled back. I didn't wait to see if they would change their minds. I turned and ran down the narrow path as fast as I could. The branches scratched at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. I stopped, gasping for breath, and listened. The forest was silent. No voices, no footsteps. I hoped that meant they weren't following me. I continued down the path at a brisk walk, my flashlight flickering as the batteries started to die. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the glimmer of the main road through the trees. Relief washed over me, but I didn't slow down until I was standing on the asphalt. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. I had no choice but to start walking towards the nearest town. It took me until dawn to reach a small gas station. I must have looked a sight because the clerk immediately asked if I was okay. I told them what happened, and they called the police. I gave a statement, but I didn't have much hope that anything would come of it. The men had been careful, and I doubted they would be easy to find. I drove home that day, my hands shaking the whole way. I haven't been camping since. Working the graveyard shift at the hospital was usually quiet. It was past midnight, and I was alone in the nurse's station, catching up on paperwork. The halls were empty except for the occasional beep of a monitor or the shuffle of a patient getting up to use the restroom. It was peaceful, in a way. I had just started my rounds when I noticed something strange. The security camera feed on my monitor flickered, showing a shadowy figure moving through the lobby. I squinted, trying to make out who it was, but the figure disappeared from view before I could see clearly. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just one of the night janitors, and continued with my rounds. As I walked down the dimly lit corridor, I heard a faint noise behind me. I stopped and turned around, but there was no one there. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I entered one of the patient rooms to check on Mr. Thompson, an elderly man recovering from surgery. He was fast asleep, his breathing steady. I adjusted his blanket and quietly left the room, closing the door behind me. As I walked back to the nurse's station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced at the security monitor again and saw the same shadowy figure, this time in one of the back hallways. My heart began to race. I picked up the phone to call security, but the line was dead. Panic started to set in. I remembered the stories I had heard about a disgruntled ex-employee who was fired a few months ago. He had blamed me, among others, for his termination. I never thought he would come back, but now I wasn't so sure. I decided to head to the security office myself. I walked quickly, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. When I reached the office, the door was ajar, and the room was dark. I called out, but there was no answer. I stepped inside and found the security guard unconscious on the floor, a trickle of blood running down his forehead. I gasped and backed out of the room, my mind racing. I needed to find help, but I was alone. I grabbed the guard's walkie-talkie and tried to radio for help, but all I got was static. I was on my own. I knew I had to stay calm and think. The hospital was a maze of hallways and rooms. I could hide until morning, but I had to be smart about it. I decided to head to the supply closet on the third floor. It was small and had a lock on the inside. As I made my way up the stairs, I heard footsteps behind me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the third floor and darted into the supply closet, locking the door behind me. I sank to the floor, trying to catch my breath. I listened intently, hoping the footsteps would fade away, but they grew louder. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I could hear the sound of someone breathing heavily. I closed my eyes, willing them to go away. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved on. I let out a shaky breath and tried to think of my next move. I couldn't stay in the supply closet all night. I had to find a way to get out of the hospital and call for help. I peeked out of the door and saw that the hallway was empty. I crept out and made my way to the stairwell, heading down to the ground floor. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw the shadowy figure again, this time standing at the end of the hallway. He turned and looked directly at me. My blood ran cold as I recognized the face of the ex-employee. His eyes were filled with rage. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I could hear him chasing after me, his footsteps growing louder and closer. I darted into an empty patient room and hid under the bed, trying to control my breathing. He entered the room, his heavy boots thudding on the tile floor. I could see his feet as he walked around, searching for me. He muttered angrily to himself, cursing my name. I held my breath, hoping he wouldn't look under the bed. After a few minutes, he left the room, slamming the door behind him. I waited a few moments before crawling out from under the bed. I had to find a way to stop him before he hurt anyone else. I remembered there was a phone in the doctor's lounge on the second floor. It was a long shot, but I had to try. I made my way back to the stairwell and climbed up to the second floor. The lounge was just down the hall. I reached the door and tried the handle. It was locked. I cursed under my breath and looked around for another way in. I spotted a window that led into the lounge. It was a tight fit, but I managed to squeeze through. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. The operator answered, and I quickly explained the situation. She assured me that help was on the way and told me to stay on the line. I heard a noise behind me and turned to see the ex-employee standing in the doorway, a twisted smile on his face. He lunged at me, and I dropped the phone, scrambling to get away. I grabbed a chair and swung it at him, hitting him in the side. He grunted in pain but didn't stop. He grabbed my arm and shoved me against the wall. I struggled, kicking and screaming, but he was too strong. Just as he was about to hit me, the door burst open and 2 police officers rushed in. They tackled him to the ground and handcuffed him. I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face. The officers helped me up and escorted me out of the hospital. I was shaking, but I was safe. They took my statement and assured me that the ex-employee would be taken care of. I never worked a graveyard shift again after that night. The hospital was supposed to be a place of healing and safety, but it had become a place of fear. The night started out great. I was at this huge house party in the city loft, the kind that spills out into the hallways and stairwells. Music was blasting, people were everywhere, and the place had this cool, industrial vibe with exposed brick and high ceilings. I didn't know the host well, but a friend of mine insisted it was the party of the year. I lost track of my friend pretty quickly. It was one of those places where you could walk into a room and suddenly be in a different world. I ended up in this large room on the second floor. It was quieter, with people chatting in small groups. There were big windows looking out over the city, and I thought I'd take a moment to enjoy the view. I was just starting to relax when a group of men walked in. They were rough looking, not the kind you'd expect at a party like this. I noticed them eyeing everyone in the room, sizing them up. Something about them made me uneasy, so I decided to leave and find my friend. I headed for the door, but one of the guys stepped in front of me. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. I tried to brush it off, saying I was just looking for a friend, but he didn't move. The others started closing in, and that's when I realized I was in trouble. The mood in the room shifted. Conversations died down, and everyone sensed something was off. The men pulled out guns, ordering everyone to sit on the floor. Panic spread, but no one dared to resist. I was shoved into a corner, my heart pounding. One of the men, who seemed to be the leader, started talking. He said they were there to rob the place and couldn't afford to leave any witnesses. The fear in the room was palpable. I couldn't believe this was happening. It felt like a nightmare. I looked around, trying to find a way out. The windows were too high up, and the only door was guarded. My mind raced, trying to think of something, anything, to get out of this alive. They made everyone hand over their phones and wallets. When it was my turn, I tried to keep calm and handed everything over. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. One of the men laughed at me, but I could tell he was on edge too. The leader made a call on his phone, speaking in hushed tones. From what I could gather, they were waiting for someone else to arrive. That gave me a sliver of hope. Maybe I could do something before then. I remembered seeing a fire escape outside the windows earlier. If I could get to it, I might have a chance. I started inching towards the windows, trying not to draw attention to myself. One of the men noticed and yelled at me to stop. I froze, my heart sinking. They started arguing amongst themselves, which gave me a small window of opportunity. I noticed one of the guys had left the door slightly ajar. I took a deep breath and bolted for it, throwing it open and sprinting down the hallway. Shouts erupted behind me, and I heard footsteps chasing after me. I didn't look back. I just ran, my lungs burning and my legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. I barreled down the stairs, taking them two at a time. I reached the main floor and darted into the kitchen. I could hear them getting closer. I grabbed a heavy frying pan, hoping it might help if they caught up to me. I spotted a back door and ran for it, bursting out into an alley. The cold night air hit me like a slap. I could hear sirens in the distance, but they were still too far away. I ran down the alley, looking for a place to hide. I saw a dumpster and dove behind it, trying to make myself as small as possible. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps were getting closer. I gripped the frying pan, ready to swing if I had to. The footsteps stopped right in front of the dumpster. I could hear them talking, their voices angry and tense. They moved on, continuing down the alley. I waited, counting to 100 before daring to peek out. The coast was clear. I crept out from behind the dumpster and started running again, my mind focused on finding help. I made it to a busy street, gasping for breath. I saw a police car parked outside a convenience store and ran towards it, waving my arms frantically. The officers got out, looking alarmed. I managed to explain what was happening, and they called for backup. Within minutes, the area was swarming with police. They stormed the loft, and I watched from a safe distance as they brought out the men in handcuffs. Relief washed over me, but I knew I wouldn't feel truly safe until I was far away from this place. The police took my statement, and I called my friend to let them know I was okay. They were still inside, hiding in a bathroom. We reunited outside, both of us shaken but grateful to be alive. That night changed me. I used to think of the city as a place of endless possibilities, but now I see the shadows lurking in the corners. I had always thought of the farmhouse as a safe place. It belonged to my grandparents, and I would visit it every summer growing up. After they passed away, my parents inherited it. This year, they asked me to stay there for a few weeks to take care of some repairs. It was a bit out of the way, in the middle of nowhere, but I didn't mind. I enjoyed the peace and quiet. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The drive was long, and I was tired. The sun was starting to set, casting a warm glow over the fields. I unpacked my things and settled in, enjoying the silence. I decided to spend the first night just relaxing, watching TV, and reading a book. As the night went on, a storm rolled in. The rain was heavy, and the wind howled through the trees. I liked the sound of it. It was comforting, in a way. I went to bed early, hoping to get a good night's sleep before starting the repairs in the morning. I woke up around midnight. Something felt off. I sat up in bed and listened. The storm had passed, but the house was too quiet. I heard a faint sound coming from outside. I couldn't place it at first, but it was getting closer. I got out of bed and walked to the window. I didn't see anything unusual, just the dark outline of the barn and the trees swaying in the wind. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. An hour later, I heard a noise again, this time from inside the house. My heart started to race. I got out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed. I opened my bedroom door slowly and peeked out into the hallway. It was dark, and I couldn't see much. I heard footsteps coming from the kitchen. They were slow and deliberate. I crept down the hallway, trying to be as quiet as possible. When I reached the kitchen, I saw that the back door was open. It had been locked when I went to bed. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone was in the house. I turned to go back to my room and call the police, but then I remembered that the phone lines were down. The storm must have knocked them out. I heard the footsteps again, this time coming towards me. I had to think fast. I ran to the living room and hid behind the couch. I could hear the intruder moving through the house, opening doors and drawers. They were looking for something. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps got closer and closer until they were right outside the living room. I gripped the baseball bat tightly, ready to defend myself if I had to. The intruder walked into the living room. I could see their shadow on the wall. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, but then they turned and walked back towards the kitchen. I let out a silent sigh of relief. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. I needed to find a way to escape. I decided to make a run for it. I got up from behind the couch and sprinted towards the front door. Just as I reached it, I heard the intruder shout behind me. I threw open the door and ran outside into the night. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet and slippery. I ran towards the barn, hoping I could hide there until the intruder gave up and left. I reached the barn and ducked inside, closing the door quietly behind me. I hid behind a stack of hay bales, trying to catch my breath. I could hear the intruder outside, searching for me. They were getting closer. I looked around the barn, trying to find something I could use to defend myself. I found an old pitchfork and grabbed it, holding it tightly in my hands. I knew I would have to fight if they found me. The barn door creaked open, and the intruder stepped inside. They were holding a flashlight, scanning the room. The light passed over the hay bales, but they didn't see me. They walked further into the barn, and I took my chance. I jumped out from behind the hay bales and lunged at the intruder with the pitchfork. They were caught off guard and stumbled backwards, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I didn't wait to see if they were okay. I ran out of the barn and headed for the woods. I could hear the intruder shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran through the trees, branches scratching at my face and arms. I kept running until I couldn't hear the intruder anymore. I stopped to catch my breath and looked around. I was deep in the woods, and it was pitch black. I had no idea where I was or how to get back to the farmhouse. I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby and froze. I held the pitchfork out in front of me, ready to defend myself. But it was just a deer, and it bounded away into the darkness. I knew I couldn't stay in the woods all night. I had to find help. I started walking, hoping to find a road or a house. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a light in the distance. It was a farmhouse, similar to my grandparents'. I ran towards it, hoping someone would be home. I banged on the door, shouting for help. A man opened the door, looking confused and concerned. I told him what happened, and he let me inside. He called the police, and they arrived within minutes. They searched the area but couldn't find the intruder. They told me it was safe to go back to the farmhouse, but I was too shaken to stay there alone. The man who helped me offered to let me stay with his family for the night, and I gratefully accepted. The next day, I went back to the farmhouse with the police. They found signs of a break-in but no clues as to who the intruder was. I never found out who it was or why they were in the house. I finished the repairs and left the farmhouse as soon as I could. I still visit from time to time, but I'm always on edge, never feeling completely safe. I had been looking forward to our camping trip in the Rockies for months. It was supposed to be a break from our busy lives, just me and my two best friends, Mike and Jake. We had planned everything meticulously, packed all the gear, and drove out early on a Friday morning. The drive was long but filled with laughter and excitement. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was already beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the mountains. We set up our tents and got a fire going. The first night was perfect. We cooked hot dogs over the fire, drank a few beers, and shared stories under the stars. It felt like the kind of night where nothing could go wrong. But looking back, maybe it was too perfect. The next morning, we decided to go for a hike. The trail was beautiful, winding through dense forest and opening up to stunning vistas. We took our time, enjoying the scenery and each other's company. After a few hours, we turned back to the campsite, eager to relax and maybe go for a swim in the nearby lake. When we got back to the campsite, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but then I noticed that our things had been moved. Mike's backpack was open, and Jake's tent flap was unzipped. We exchanged uneasy glances. Jake suggested it might have been a curious animal, but I wasn't so sure. We decided to stay close to the campsite for the rest of the day, just in case. As the afternoon wore on, the feeling of unease grew stronger. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves we were just being paranoid. But then, as the sun began to set, we heard voices. Two men emerged from the trees, rough-looking and carrying rifles. One of them, a tall guy with a scruffy beard, spoke first. "Evening, fellas. Looks like you've got a nice setup here." We didn't respond right away, just stared at them, trying to gauge their intentions. The second man, shorter but stockier, smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. "We were just passing through and thought we'd say hello. Mind if we join you for a bit?" Mike, always the diplomat, forced a smile and nodded. "Sure, why not?" The men sat down by our fire, and we reluctantly joined them. They introduced themselves as Bill and Dave, though I had a feeling those weren't their real names. They asked us about our trip, where we were from, what we did for work. It felt like an interrogation. After a while, Dave stood up and stretched. "You know, it's getting late. We should be heading out." But as they turned to leave, Bill suddenly spun around and pointed his rifle at us. On second thought, we could use some supplies. "Hand over your gear, and no one gets hurt." We were stunned. Mike tried to reason with them, but Bill just pressed the barrel of his rifle against Mike's chest. I said, "Hand it over." We had no choice. We handed over our backpacks, our wallets, even our phones. They took everything, leaving us with nothing but the clothes on our backs. Then they disappeared into the woods, leaving us in shock. For a few minutes, none of us spoke. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "We need to get out of here." But getting out wasn't going to be easy. Without our gear, we had no way to navigate, no food, no water. And the nearest town was miles away. We decided to stay put for the night and figure out a plan in the morning. That night was the longest of my life. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I kept expecting the men to come back. We took turns keeping watch, but none of us got much sleep. At first light, we started walking. We knew the general direction of the main road, but without a map or compass, we were mostly guessing. The terrain was rough, and the sun was blazing. By midday, we were exhausted and dehydrated. We found a small stream and drank greedily. It was a relief, but we knew we couldn't stay there. We pressed on, hoping to find the road before nightfall. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. In the late afternoon, we heard a noise behind us. We turned and saw Bill and Dave coming through the trees. They had found us again. Panic set in. We started to run, but they were faster. "Stop!" Bill shouted. We just wanted to talk. But we didn't stop. We ran as fast as we could, dodging trees and stumbling over roots. I could hear them behind us, getting closer. My lungs were burning. My legs felt like they were on fire. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. We burst out of the trees onto a dirt road. Relief flooded through me. But then I realized it was a dead end. We were trapped. Bill and Dave emerged from the forest, grinning. "Nowhere to run," Dave said, raising his rifle. I knew we had to fight. I grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at Dave. It hit him in the face, and he stumbled back, cursing. Mike and Jake followed my lead, grabbing sticks and rocks, anything they could find. The fight was chaotic. Bill and Dave were tough, but we were desperate. We managed to knock Bill's rifle out of his hands, and Mike tackled him to the ground. Jake and I wrestled with Dave, trying to get the rifle away from him. In the struggle, the rifle went off. The sound was deafening. For a moment, everything was still. Then Dave slumped to the ground, blood pouring from his side. Bill, seeing his friend down, scrambled to his feet and ran into the forest. We were left standing there, shaking and panting. We didn't know what to do. Dave was still alive, but barely. We had to get help. Mike stayed with Dave while Jake and I ran down the road, hoping to find someone, anyone who could help. After what felt like hours, we found a ranger station. We burst inside, telling the ranger everything. He called for backup, and soon the place was swarming with police. They found Bill hiding in the forest and took him into custody. Dave was airlifted to a hospital, and we were finally safe. The whole experience left us shaken. We never went camping again after that. The Rockies, which had once seemed so beautiful and serene, now felt dangerous and threatening. Working the late shift at the convenience store was usually quiet. I liked the calm, the time to think. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint sound of traffic outside were the only noises. It was just after 11 p.m. when he walked in. At first, nothing seemed strange. He wore a hoodie, which wasn't unusual for the chilly night. But when he moved closer, I saw the mask. My heart started pounding. He pulled a gun from his pocket and pointed it at me. "Empty the register," he said, voice muffled by the mask. My hand shook as I fumbled with the keys. I kept glancing up, hoping for a customer to come in or for someone to pass by outside. No one did. The drawer slid open with a ding, and I began taking out the cash. "Hurry up," he barked, waving the gun. I handed him the money. He shoved it into a bag and then looked around the store. His eyes fell on me again. "You," he said, "come with me." Panic surged through me. "Please, I won't call anyone. Just take the money and go." He stepped closer, jabbing the gun toward me. "Shut up and move." I had no choice. He grabbed my arm and pulled me around the counter. We walked toward the back of the store, where the storeroom and the staff bathroom were. He pushed me into the storeroom and closed the door behind us. "Sit," he ordered, pointing to a chair in the corner. I sat, heart racing, trying to think of a way out. He stood by the door, watching me. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. I swallowed hard. "Lisa," I replied. "Well, Lisa, you're going to help me," he said, his voice low and threatening. "If you do, I won't hurt you." "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need a place to hide for a while," he said. "And you're going to make sure no one knows I'm here." He made me sit in the chair while he went through the storeroom, checking the small window and the door. He seemed satisfied that we were alone. He came back and stood over me, the gun never leaving his hand. Hours passed. He made me call the store's manager, telling them I was sick and had to close early. I lied as convincingly as I could, praying they wouldn't come to check on me. The robber watched me the whole time, making sure I said the right things. After the call, he let me use the bathroom. The small room had a window, but it was too high and too small to escape through. I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing. When I came out, he was still there, the gun pointed at me. "Don't try anything," he warned. I nodded, feeling hopeless. We went back to the storeroom, and he made me sit again. He seemed restless, pacing back and forth. I watched him, trying to figure out what to do. Then I remembered the panic button under the counter, near the register. If I could get to it, I might be able to call for help. "I need some water," I said, trying to sound calm. He looked at me, suspicious. "Where?" "In the front, by the counter," I said. "There's a small fridge." He hesitated, then nodded. "Fine. But no funny business." We walked back to the front of the store. I could see the panic button just out of reach. I opened the fridge and took out a bottle of water. "Can I sit down for a minute?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. He nodded, still holding the gun. I sat on the stool behind the counter, the panic button inches from my hand. I unscrewed the cap and took a sip, stalling for time. "Are you almost done?" he asked, impatience creeping into his voice. "Yeah," I said, putting the bottle down. I took a deep breath and then, in one quick motion, I reached under the counter and hit the button. "What did you do?" he shouted, stepping forward. He grabbed my arm, yanking me up. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything." I lied, trying to pull away. He looked around wildly, then dragged me back to the storeroom. "You better hope no one shows up," he hissed, shoving me into the chair again. Minutes felt like hours. I kept praying someone would come, that the silent alarm would bring help. The robber paced, checking his watch, glancing at the door. Then we heard it, the sound of sirens in the distance. He panicked. "What did you do?" he screamed, pointing the gun at me. "You called them." I shook my head, trying to look innocent. "I didn't. I swear." The sirens grew louder. He grabbed a bag of money and backed toward the door. "You're coming with me," he said, pulling me up from the chair. He dragged me out of the storeroom and through the back exit. We were in the alley behind the store, the sirens getting closer. He looked around, trying to decide which way to go. Suddenly, the alley was filled with flashing lights. Police cars screeched to a halt, and officers jumped out, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon," one of them shouted. The robber froze, his grip on my arm tightening. "Let her go and drop the gun," the officer commanded again. For a moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, the robber released me. I stumbled forward, away from him. He dropped the gun, raising his hands. The police rushed in, tackling him to the ground. I stood there, shaking, as they cuffed him and led him away. One of the officers came over to me. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. I nodded, though I felt anything but okay. They took me to the station to give a statement, and I finally felt safe. The manager arrived, relieved that I was unharmed. It was over, but the terror of that night stayed with me. I never worked the late shift again. Every time I walked past the store, I felt a chill. It was a reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. I went to a frat party last night, something I usually avoided. It was loud and crowded, people everywhere. I had just gotten a beer and was trying to find a place to sit when I saw something weird in the corner of the room. 3 guys huddled together, talking in low voices. One of them kept looking around, nervous. I couldn't hear what they were saying over the music, but their body language was off. One of them pulled out a small bag, and I realized it was full of pills. The other guy handed him a wad of cash. I turned away, not wanting to see more. But I saw enough. As I walked away, I heard a shout. The guy with the cash started yelling, accusing the dealer of shorting him. Things escalated quickly. The dealer pulled out a knife. My heart raced, and I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and pushed through the crowd, trying to find the door. I felt someone grab my shoulder. It was the dealer, eyes wild. "You saw nothing, got it?" he snarled. I nodded, terrified. He let go, and I bolted, pushing through people who were too drunk to notice. The music was so loud, I could barely think. I just needed to get out. I reached the back of the house, where a bunch of people were smoking. I figured I could slip out the back gate. But when I got there, it was locked. I had to find another way. I ducked back inside, trying to stay calm. I weaved through the kitchen, almost running into a girl mixing drinks. She gave me a weird look, but I kept moving. I found a staircase and ran up, hoping to find an open window or another exit. But the upstairs was packed with people too. As I reached the top, I heard footsteps behind me. I glanced back and saw the dealer and his friend pushing through the crowd, looking for me. I ducked into a bedroom and closed the door quietly. My heart was pounding so loud, I was sure they could hear it. The room was dark, just a small lamp on the nightstand. I looked around, desperate for a place to hide. The closet was full of coats, so I squeezed in and closed the door. I could hear the party outside, muffled by the lulls. Minutes felt like hours. I held my breath when I heard the door creak open. They were in the room. "I know you're in here," one of them said. I could see through a small crack in the closet door. The dealer was pacing, knife in hand. "Come out, and we won't hurt you," he lied. I stayed still, praying they wouldn't check the closet. The other guy started opening drawers, looking under the bed. My heart raced. I was trapped. The closet door swung open. I froze, expecting the worst. But they got distracted by a noise outside the room. Someone was calling them. "Let's go," the other guy said. "We'll find him later." They left, slamming the door behind them. I waited a few minutes, making sure they were really gone. I slipped out of the closet and tiptoed to the door. The hallway was clear. I had to get downstairs and out without being seen. I moved quickly, staying close to the wall. I could hear the dealer and his friend downstairs, arguing with someone. I reached the staircase and started down, trying to blend in with the partygoers. When I got to the living room, I saw my chance. The front door was open, people coming and going. I slipped through the crowd and out the door. The cool night air hit me, and I felt a rush of relief. I started walking quickly, not daring to look back. I needed to get far away from the house. I pulled out my phone and called my roommate. "Dude, come get me," I said. "I'm at the corner of Pine and 3rd. Hurry." I kept walking, putting as much distance between me and the party as I could. My roommate pulled up a few minutes later, and I jumped in the car. "Go, just go," I told him. He sped off, asking what happened. I told him everything, and he shook his head. "You're lucky they didn't find you," he said. When we got back to our place, I finally felt safe. I couldn't believe how close I came to getting seriously hurt. I stayed up all night, thinking about it. I knew I'd never forget the fear I felt, hiding in that closet, hoping they wouldn't find me. I decided then that frat parties weren't for me. I was done with that scene. It wasn't worth the risk. I was just glad I made it out alive. I decided to take a break from everything and rented a cabin in the woods for a few days. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. The cabin was pretty isolated, no neighbors for miles. Just me and the quiet. It sounded perfect. The first night was uneventful. I cooked dinner, read a book, and enjoyed the silence. The next day, I went for a hike and took some photos of the scenery. It was exactly what I needed to unwind. That evening, I settled in with a cup of tea, planning to watch a movie before bed. I was halfway through the movie when I heard a noise outside. It sounded like footsteps. I paused the movie and listened. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but the footsteps were too heavy. They sounded like human footsteps. I got up and went to the window. It was dark outside, and I couldn't see anything. I turned off the lights inside to get a better look. My heart started pounding when I saw movement near the edge of the clearing. There were 3 men, and they were heading towards the cabin. I quickly locked the doors and windows, hoping they would just leave. But they didn't. They reached the porch and tried the door. When they found it locked, one of them knocked, calling out that they needed help. I didn't respond. They started talking among themselves, and I could hear frustration in their voices. One of them said they should break in. That's when I realized they weren't here for help. They were here to rob the place. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but there was no signal. I was on my own. I had to think fast. I remembered there was a small crawl space in the bedroom closet. I could hide there. I grabbed a kitchen knife for protection and hurried to the bedroom. I could hear them trying to force the door open. They were getting louder and more aggressive. I crawled into the closet and squeezed into the crawl space, pulling the door shut behind me. It was cramped and dark, but I felt a little safer hidden away. I listened as they finally broke the door and entered the cabin. They were ransacking the place, looking for valuables. I could hear things being thrown around, furniture being overturned. My heart was racing, and I tried to stay as quiet as possible. One of them came into the bedroom. I could hear him opening drawers and looking through the closet. He didn't find the crawl space, thankfully, and eventually moved on to the next room. But I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. I had to find a way to get out. They started arguing about how to divide whatever they had found. One of them mentioned that they didn't expect anyone to be here. That gave me a bit of hope. Maybe they would leave once they were done. I waited for what felt like hours, but it was probably only about 30 minutes. They finally seemed to have gathered everything they wanted. They started talking about leaving, but then one of them said they should make sure no one was hiding. My stomach dropped. I knew I had to move before they decided to do a thorough search. I carefully crawled out of the space and crept towards the back door. I heard footsteps coming closer, and my panic rose. I had to get out now. I quietly unlocked the back door and slipped outside. The night was cold and dark, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away from the cabin. I moved quickly but quietly, trying not to make any noise that would alert them. I headed towards the tree line, hoping to find some cover. As I reached the trees, I heard a shout from the cabin. They had discovered I was gone. I ran as fast as I could, adrenaline pushing me forward. I could hear them behind me, but I didn't look back. I kept running until I couldn't hear them anymore. I found a dense area of trees and hid there, trying to catch my breath. I listened for any signs of them, but all I heard was my own heavy breathing and the sounds of the forest. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. Eventually, I started to make my way back, cautiously. When I got close to the cabin, I stayed hidden and watched for any sign of the burglars. They were gone. I crept back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. The place was a mess, but I was alive. I found my phone and finally got a signal. I called the police and told them everything. They arrived about an hour later, took my statement, and started searching the area. The burglars were never caught, but I was just glad to be safe. That was the scariest night of my life, and I don't think I'll ever go back to that cabin again. I went camping by myself near a river in the Pacific Northwest, hoping for some peace and quiet away from the city. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, just me and nature. I found a secluded spot by the riverbank, set up my tent, and spent the afternoon fishing and exploring the area. As evening approached, I decided to gather firewood for the night. That's when I stumbled upon it, a makeshift camp hidden deeper in the woods. At first, I thought it was just another camper, but as I got closer, I saw barrels, chemical containers, and a strange smell lingering in the air. It hit me, it was a meth lab. My heart raced as I realized how dangerous the situation was. I needed to get out of there and alert the authorities. But before I could retreat, I heard voices approaching. I ducked behind a cluster of trees and watched as two men emerged from the trees. They were armed, talking in hushed tones about their operation. I knew I had to get away quietly. I slowly backed away, careful not to make any noise that would alert them. But just as I turned to leave, a branch cracked under my foot. They heard it. "Who's there?" one of them shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. My heart sank. They were coming after me. I took off running, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush behind me, shouting threats and curses. I dodged trees and leaped over fallen logs, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. The forest was dense, making it hard to navigate in the growing darkness. My only thought was to keep moving, to find a way out and get help. I could hear them gaining on me, their footsteps getting closer. Panic set in, but I pushed myself to run faster. I veered towards the river, hoping the water would slow them down. I splashed through the shallows, the cold water biting into my legs. I glanced back and saw them at the riverbank, yelling at each other. They were hesitant to follow me into the water, buying me precious seconds. I used the opportunity to scramble up the opposite bank and continued running. I didn't dare stop to catch my breath. I needed to find help, to get away from those men and their dangerous operation. I ran until I couldn't hear them anymore, until my legs felt like lead and my lungs burned. Eventually, I stumbled upon a hiking trail. I followed it, hoping it would lead me back to civilization. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had witnessed, the meth lab, the armed men, the danger I had narrowly escaped. Hours passed before I finally came across a ranger station. I burst through the door, breathless and covered in dirt and sweat. The ranger on duty looked startled but quickly took in my disheveled appearance and listened to my frantic explanation. They called the police immediately. I gave them all the details I could remember, the location of the meth lab, descriptions of the men, everything. They assured me they would send officers out to investigate right away. I stayed at the ranger station until the police arrived. They took my statement and assured me they would do everything they could to apprehend the men responsible. I felt relieved but still shaken by the ordeal. The police drove me back to the campground to collect my belongings. They searched the area thoroughly, finding the meth lab exactly where I had described. It was a chilling confirmation of what I had stumbled upon. In the following days, I cooperated with the police, providing more details as they pieced together the investigation. They eventually caught the men, thanks to the information I provided and evidence they found at the scene. I was grateful to be alive and safe. The experience left me shaken, but it also taught me to be more cautious and aware of my surroundings. I never expected my camping trip to turn into a life or death situation, but it was a stark reminder of how quickly things can escalate in the wilderness. I haven't been camping alone since that day. I worked as a janitor at a high-rise office building downtown. It was a decent job, usually quiet at night. I liked the peace, just me and the empty offices. The building was mostly glass, offering a view of the city that was beautiful but also a little eerie when it was empty. One night, I was the only one on duty. It was the 10th floor, mostly law offices and some finance firms. I was mopping the hallways, thinking about nothing in particular, when I heard a noise. It sounded like metal clinking, coming from the stairwell. I figured it was probably just maintenance, but it was odd since they usually did their work during the day. I walked over to the stairwell door and listened. I heard muffled voices and the sound of something being pried open. My heart started to race. I cracked the door open just a bit to peek through, and that's when I saw them. 3 men, all dressed in black, with masks over their faces. They had tools, probably to break into the offices. I quickly closed the door, trying not to make a sound. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. These guys were clearly not supposed to be here. I needed to find a place to hide and call for help. The janitor's closet was a few doors down the hall, and I hurried over there as quietly as I could. I locked myself in and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. The operator picked up, and I whispered to them what was happening. They told me to stay hidden and that officers were on their way. I put my phone on silent and kept it close. The janitor's closet had a small vent near the bottom of the door, and I lay down to try and see what was happening outside. I could hear the men moving around, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. They were opening doors, probably looking for something specific. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped right outside the closet door. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't come in. One of them tried the door handle, but it was locked. He moved on, and I let out a silent sigh of relief. I needed to find a way to alert the police without these guys finding me. The security office was on the same floor, but it was at the other end of the hall. I would have to be very careful. I waited until I couldn't hear their footsteps anymore and slowly opened the closet door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. I crept along the wall, trying to stay in the shadows. I could hear the men talking in one of the offices, their voices low and urgent. I kept moving, one step at a time. I made it to the security office without being seen. I slipped inside and locked the door behind me. There was a control panel with monitors showing different parts of the building. I could see the men on one of the screens. They were in one of the finance offices, rummaging through files. I picked up the security phone and called 911 again, giving them more details about what the men looked like and where they were. The operator reassured me that officers were close and told me to stay hidden. I hung up and watched the monitors, my heart pounding. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before I saw the red and blue lights flashing outside the building. The men must have seen them too, because they started to panic. They grabbed whatever they could and headed for the stairwell. I watched as they disappeared from the cameras. Then, I heard the sound of police officers coming up the stairs. I unlocked the door and stepped out, waving my hands to get their attention. They rushed over to me, and I told them where the men had gone. The officers split up, some going after the men, others checking the offices to make sure no one else was inside. It didn't take long before they caught all three of them. They were handcuffed and taken away, shouting and cursing. I was shaken but relieved. The officers took my statement and told me I had done the right thing by hiding and calling for help. They said the men were after some sensitive information from one of the finance firms, something worth a lot of money. I had never been to a party like this before. It was New Year's Eve, and I had somehow snagged an invite to a luxury penthouse party in the heart of the city. The view was incredible, with floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the skyline. I felt out of place among the rich and famous, but I tried to blend in and enjoy myself. The host, a wealthy entrepreneur named Richard, was well known for throwing the most extravagant parties. The guest list was a who's who of celebrities, politicians, and business moguls. I was just a plus one, tagging along with my friend Mike, who knew someone who knew someone. The party was in full swing. Champagne flowed freely, and the music was loud. I wandered around, taking in the opulence. Everywhere I looked, there were people dressed to the nines, laughing and mingling. I felt like I was in a different world. I made my way to the balcony to get some fresh air. The night was crisp and clear, and the city lights sparkled below. As I leaned on the railing, I overheard a conversation between two men standing in the shadows nearby. At first, I wasn't paying attention, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold. One of the men was talking about a high-profile guest at the party, someone very important. They were planning to assassinate him before midnight. My heart started pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I needed to do something, but I didn't know who to trust. I stepped back into the party, scanning the room for Mike. I needed to find him and figure out what to do. But the crowd was thick, and it was hard to see anything clearly. I pushed my way through, trying to stay calm. As I moved, I caught sight of the two men I had overheard. They were making their way through the crowd, looking suspiciously alert. I ducked behind a group of people, hoping they wouldn't see me. I needed to find Mike and tell him what I had heard. Finally, I spotted him near the bar, chatting with a woman I didn't recognize. I hurried over and pulled him aside. "Mike, we have a problem," I whispered urgently. He looked at me, confused, but I didn't have time to explain everything. "There's a plot to kill someone here tonight. We need to warn them." Mike's eyes widened, and he glanced around nervously. "Are you serious?" he asked. I nodded, and he took a deep breath. "Okay, who is it? Who are they targeting?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "I just overheard them talking on the balcony. We need to find out who the target is and warn them." We moved through the crowd together, trying to act natural. I kept an eye on the two men, who were now standing near the entrance, scanning the room. They looked like they were waiting for something or someone. Mike and I approached Richard, the host, and told him what I had overheard. His face went pale, and he immediately pulled out his phone to call security. "Stay close," he told us. "We need to find out who they're after and make sure they're safe." We started discreetly asking around, trying to figure out who the high-profile guest might be. It wasn't long before we learned that the mayor was attending the party. He was a well-known figure, and his presence would certainly make headlines. Richard approached the mayor and whispered something in his ear. The mayor's expression changed from jovial to serious in an instant. He nodded and followed Richard toward a private room, with security trailing behind. I felt a moment of relief, thinking that we had managed to warn the target. But then I realized that the two men were no longer by the entrance. Panic surged through me as I scanned the room, searching for them. I saw them heading toward the private room where the mayor had just gone. They were moving quickly, and I knew we didn't have much time. I grabbed Mike's arm and we followed them, trying to stay out of sight. We reached the door to the private room just as one of the men pulled out a gun. Without thinking, I shouted, "Stop!" The man turned, and I tackled him to the ground. The gun skidded across the floor, and Mike scrambled to grab it. The second man lunged at me, but I managed to kick him away. Security burst into the room, tackling both men and restraining them. I was shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The mayor looked shaken but unharmed. Richard thanked us profusely as the police were called and the two men were taken away. The party was effectively over, with guests murmuring and leaving in a hurry. I sat down, trying to process everything that had happened. Mike and I gave our statements to the police, explaining how we had overheard the plot and managed to warn the mayor in time. They commended us for our quick thinking and bravery. As we left the penthouse, the city was still alive with New Year's celebrations. Fireworks lit up the sky, and people were cheering in the streets. It felt surreal after everything that had happened. We walked in silence for a while, both of us lost in our thoughts. Finally, Mike broke the silence. "I can't believe we just went through that," he said. I nodded, still trying to wrap my head around it all. We made our way back to our hotel, the noise of the city fading as we got further away from the party. I knew I would never forget that night, the terror of realizing someone's life was in danger and the desperate scramble to save them. Back in my room, I collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion finally catching up with me. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep, but at least I was safe. And so was the mayor, thanks to a twist of fate that had put me in the right place at the right time. It was a typical Friday night, and I had just settled in for a quiet evening in my apartment. The city outside buzzed with life, but I preferred the solitude of my small space. I lived alone on the 7th floor of a 10-story building, and my neighbors were mostly quiet, keeping to themselves. Around 10 p.m., I heard an odd noise coming from the apartment next door. At first, I thought it was just the usual sounds of an old building, pipes groaning, or maybe the neighbor moving furniture. But the noise persisted, a rhythmic thumping that grew louder by the minute. I turned off the TV and listened closely. It sounded like someone was hammering against the wall. I shrugged it off, assuming the neighbor was doing some late-night renovations. It was annoying, but I figured it would stop soon. I went to the kitchen to make some tea, hoping the noise would cease. As I poured hot water into my mug, the thumping intensified. It wasn't just a random hammering, it had a deliberate, almost desperate rhythm. I felt a chill run down my spine. I decided to knock on my neighbor's door and ask them to stop. But when I reached their door, there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time. "Hello? Is everything okay in there?" I called out. Silence. I pressed my ear against the door, but all I could hear was the relentless thumping. My heart started to race. Something was definitely wrong. I went back to my apartment and locked the door behind me. The noise seemed to follow me, growing louder and more insistent. I pressed my ear to the wall and realized it was coming from the living room. I crept closer, trying to make sense of the sound. That's when I noticed a small crack in the wall. It wasn't there before. The thumping was coming from that crack, as if someone was trying to break through. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the crack slowly widen. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but I couldn't just stand there and wait. I needed to do something to protect myself. I pushed my couch against the wall, trying to barricade it. The thumping grew louder, more frantic. I could hear the sound of plaster cracking and breaking. I grabbed a heavy chair and added it to the makeshift barricade, hoping it would hold. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the wall. The crack was now several inches wide, and I could see something moving on the other side. It looked like a hand, clawing at the wall, trying to break through. I felt a scream rising in my throat but swallowed it down. I needed to stay calm. The front door. I ran to the door and checked the locks. They were secure, but I didn't feel safe. I grabbed a kitchen knife and stood near the door, ready to defend myself if necessary. The thumping was now a deafening roar, echoing through the apartment. Minutes felt like hours. I kept glancing at the wall, expecting the worst. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me as the noise grew closer. But the thumping didn't stop. It was as if whoever was on the other side knew their time was running out. A loud crash echoed through the apartment as the wall gave way, and a man's face appeared through the hole. His eyes were wild, his expression twisted with desperation. I screamed and held the knife out in front of me, my hands trembling. The front door burst open, and 2 police officers rushed in, guns drawn. They tackled the man, pulling him away from the wall and dragging him out of the apartment. I collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down my face. The officers assured me that I was safe now, but the terror of the experience lingered. They explained that the man was a fugitive, hiding out in the building. He had been tunneling through the walls, trying to find a way to escape. I couldn't believe it. It sounded like something out of a nightmare. They took my statement and promised to have maintenance fix the wall first thing in the morning. I spent the rest of the night at a friend's place, too shaken to stay in my apartment. The next day, I returned to find the wall repaired and a new lock installed on my door. Life slowly returned to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every creak, every groan of the building made me jump. I had always considered my apartment a safe haven, but now it felt violated, tainted by the memory of that night. The plan was simple, a weekend camping trip in the national park with my 7-year-old son, Max. Just the two of us, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. I wanted to teach him how to fish, build a fire, and enjoy the serenity of nature. We set up our tent in a secluded spot by a tranquil lake, far from the main campground. The first night was perfect. We roasted marshmallows over the fire, told ghost stories, and watched the stars. Max was thrilled, his face glowing with excitement and the reflection of the flames. As he drifted off to sleep, I sat by the fire, enjoying the peace and quiet. In the middle of the night, I woke to a rustling sound outside the tent. My first thought was that it was a raccoon or some other small animal. I grabbed the flashlight and carefully unzipped the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing only the shadows of the trees and the empty campsite. I sighed in relief and went back to sleep. The next morning, we hiked a few trails and fished in the lake. Max caught his first fish, and we cooked it for lunch. It was shaping up to be the perfect getaway. In the afternoon, we explored a little deeper into the forest, discovering hidden streams and fascinating wildlife. As the sun began to set, we made our way back to the campsite. That's when I noticed something strange. Our food supplies had been rummaged through, and several items were missing. I tried to stay calm for Max's sake, brushing it off as the work of a curious animal. But deep down, I felt uneasy. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified in the silence. Max fell asleep easily, exhausted from the day's adventures, but I lay awake, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again, a rustling sound, closer this time. I grabbed the flashlight and quietly stepped out of the tent. As I swept the beam across the campsite, I saw them, 2 men, their clothes dirty and torn, standing at the edge of the clearing. My heart pounded as I realized these were not hikers. They were convicts, likely escaped from a nearby prison. I quickly stepped back into the tent, my mind racing. I had to protect Max. I zipped up the tent as quietly as possible and grabbed the hunting knife I always carried when camping. I could hear the men whispering outside, their voices low and menacing. "We need supplies," one of them said. "The kid's asleep. Just grab what you can and let's go." "Don't worry," the other replied. "We'll get what we need." I held my breath, hoping they would leave. But then I heard footsteps approaching the tent. My grip tightened on the knife. I couldn't let them harm Max. "Hey, anyone in there?" one of the men called out, his voice closer now. I didn't respond. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I made a quick decision. I had to confront them before they did something worse. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, holding the knife in front of me. The flashlight beam illuminated their faces, rough, desperate, and dangerous. "Stay back," I warned, trying to keep my voice steady. "I have a weapon, and I'll use it if I have to." The men exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. "We just need some supplies," the taller one said. "We don't want any trouble." "You've already caused trouble," I said. "Leave now, and we won't have a problem." The shorter man took a step forward. "You don't understand. We're not leaving without what we need. In that moment, I realized talking wasn't going to work. I had to think fast. The only option was to scare them off. I turned the flashlight toward the woods and shouted, "Hey! Over here! Help!" For a split second, the men hesitated, glancing nervously into the darkness. I knew it wouldn't be long before they realized I was bluffing. I had to act now. I lunged at the shorter man, slashing with the knife. He yelped and stumbled back, clutching his arm. "Run!" I shouted to Max, who had woken up and was peeking out of the tent, wide-eyed with fear. "Run to the lake." Max bolted out of the tent, and I followed, keeping myself between him and the convicts. We ran through the trees, the sound of our pursuers crashing through the underbrush behind us. My mind raced, trying to think of a plan. We reached the lake, and I quickly scanned the area. There was a small ranger station on the other side, barely visible in the moonlight. It was our only hope. "Max, keep running to the station. Don't look back." Max nodded, tears streaming down his face, and took off again. I turned to face the convicts, who were closing in. "Leave us alone," I shouted, brandishing the knife. "The Rangers will be here any minute." The taller man snarled. "You're lying. No one's coming." I took a step back, then another, trying to buy Max more time. Suddenly, I heard the sound of a motor. A Ranger's ATV, headlights cutting through the darkness, speeding toward us. Relief washed over me as the vehicle skidded to a stop, and a Ranger jumped out, his flashlight and gun trained on the convicts. "Freeze!" the Ranger shouted. The men hesitated, then turned and fled into the woods. The Ranger didn't pursue them, instead turning his attention to us. "Are you okay?" he asked, his face concerned. "We're fine," I said, my voice shaking. "They didn't hurt us." The Ranger called for backup, and soon the area was swarming with law enforcement. Max and I were escorted to safety, our ordeal finally over. The convicts were captured the next day, hiding in an abandoned cabin deep in the forest. The rest of the weekend was a blur. We were taken to the hospital for a checkup and then to a safe location until the authorities were sure the area was secure. Max clung to me, his fear slowly subsiding as he realized we were safe. It took a while for us to recover from that night. Max had nightmares for weeks, and I couldn't shake the memory of those desperate faces. But we were safe, and that was what mattered. In time, we went on more camping trips, but we were always more cautious, more aware of the dangers that could lurk in the wilderness. The old diner sat on the edge of town, surrounded by fields and the occasional farmhouse. It was a quiet place, especially at night. I usually worked the late shift, serving the few regulars who stopped by for coffee and pie. The night started like any other. I wiped down the counters, refilled the sugar dispensers, and hummed along to the country music playing softly from the jukebox. Around 9 o'clock, the usual crowd had thinned out, leaving me alone except for Bob, a trucker who always came in for a late dinner. He sat in his usual booth, nursing a cup of coffee and reading a newspaper. Outside, the wind howled, and the neon sign buzzed, casting an eerie glow over the empty parking lot. It was then that I noticed a car. A beat-up old sedan, its headlights cutting through the darkness. It drove slowly past the diner, then turned around and drove past again. At first, I thought maybe they were lost, but when it happened a third time, I felt a knot of unease in my stomach. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just looking for a place to pull over. But as the minutes ticked by, the car kept circling, never stopping. Bob looked up from his newspaper and noticed my distraction. "Everything all right, Jess?" he asked, his gruff voice tinged with concern. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just a weird car outside. Probably nothing." Bob nodded but didn't seem convinced. He went back to his paper, and I went back to cleaning, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The car made another pass, and this time it stopped at the edge of the parking lot. My heart pounded as I watched two figures inside, their faces hidden in shadow. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 10, and I was supposed to close up soon. I hoped the car would leave, but instead, the engine cut off, and the occupants remained inside. The knot in my stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. I walked over to the door and locked it, trying not to make it obvious. Bob noticed and raised an eyebrow. "You sure you're okay?" "Yeah," I lied. "Just being cautious." He nodded, took a last sip of his coffee, and stood up. "Well, I better hit the road. You stay safe, Jess." "Thanks, Bob," I said, watching him leave. I wished he could stay, but I didn't want to worry him. As his truck rumbled away, the parking lot felt even more desolate. The car still hadn't moved. I tried to busy myself with closing tasks, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. Finally, one of the figures stepped out of the car. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a hooded jacket. He stood by the car for a moment, looking toward the diner, then started walking across the lot. My heart raced as he approached. I ducked behind the counter, hoping he wouldn't see me. I heard the door rattle as he tried to open it, then a heavy knock. "Hey, anyone in there?" he called out, his voice muffled by the glass. I didn't answer, praying he would go away. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. "I know someone's in there. I just need to use the phone." I stayed hidden, my mind racing. Why would he need to use the phone in the middle of nowhere? My cell phone was in my bag, but I didn't dare move to get it. The man pounded on the door again, then cursed under his breath. I peeked over the counter and saw him talking to the second figure, who had now stepped out of the car. A woman equally as menacing, her face hard and cold. They exchanged a few words, then started looking around the building. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they were searching for another way in. I needed to do something, but what? The phone on the wall behind me was my best bet, but I had to move quickly. I crawled to the back, keeping low, and reached up to grab the receiver. My hand shook as I dialed 911, praying the call would go through quickly. The phone rang, and a voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? I whispered, I'm at Mel's Diner, and there are 2 people trying to break in. Please send help. Stay on the line, the operator said. Officers are on their way. I hung up, not wanting to make any noise, and crept back to my hiding spot. The man had found the back door and was now trying to force it open. I heard the wood creak and splinter as he shoved against it. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. I could hear the man cursing and the woman urging him on. My mind raced with fear. What if the police didn't get here in time? What if they got in? Suddenly, the back door gave way with a loud crash. I stifled a scream and ducked lower behind the counter. The man's heavy footsteps echoed through the kitchen as he searched for me. Come out, wherever you are, he taunted, his voice dripping with malice. I pressed myself against the floor, barely daring to breathe. The woman joined him, her footsteps lighter but no less threatening. They moved through the diner, overturning chairs and searching every corner. She's gotta be here somewhere, the woman said. Find her. I heard them moving closer, their shadows falling over my hiding spot. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it. Just as I thought they would find me, the sound of sirens pierced the night air. The man cursed again. Cops. Let's get out of here. They ran for the back door, their footsteps fading into the night. I stayed hidden, too afraid to move until I heard the voices of the police officers entering the diner. "Ma'am, are you all right?" one of them called out. I slowly stood up, my legs trembling. "I'm here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The officers escorted me outside, where their patrol car's lights flashed red and blue. I told them everything that had happened, and they promised to search the area for the intruders. As they drove me home, I couldn't stop shaking. The terror of the night had left me shaken to the core. The beach house was perfect. 3 stories tall, with large windows overlooking the ocean, it was the ideal place for Jeff's bachelor party. We had been planning this weekend for months. A group of old college friends, we were looking forward to a few days of fun and relaxation before Jeff's wedding. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, our cars packed with food, drinks, and enough gear for a small army. The first night was a blur of laughter, beers, and stories of old times. It felt good to be back together, away from the stresses of work and daily life. Saturday morning came with the promise of sunshine and a day on the beach. We spent hours swimming, playing volleyball, and lounging in the sand. By late afternoon, we headed back to the house to shower and get ready for the evening's festivities. It was then that I first noticed something odd about Craig. Craig was a friend of Jeff's from his new job. None of us knew him well, but he seemed friendly enough. Still, there was something off about the way he kept to himself, watching us with a strange intensity. As the evening progressed, my unease grew. Craig kept asking questions about our lives, digging for details that felt intrusive. He didn't seem interested in Jeff at all, which was odd for a guy attending his bachelor party. I mentioned it to Paul, one of my closest friends, but he brushed it off as paranoia. Night fell, and the party moved to the deck overlooking the beach. We lit a fire in the pit and settled into chairs, the conversation turning to Jeff's upcoming wedding. Craig sat on the edge, his eyes glinting in the firelight, listening more than talking. Around midnight, I went inside to grab another drink. As I passed the kitchen, I saw Craig rifling through Jeff's bag. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped back into the shadows, watching as he pulled out Jeff's phone and started scrolling through it. I confronted him. "What are you doing, Craig?" He looked up, startled, and then smiled, a cold, unconvincing smile. "Just looking for a charger." "That's Jeff's phone," I said, stepping closer. "You could have asked." Craig's eyes narrowed. "Sorry, didn't mean to cause trouble." I watched him put the phone back and leave the kitchen. My gut told me something was seriously wrong. I decided to keep an eye on him for the rest of the night. As the party wound down, people started heading to bed. I made sure to lock my door, a sense of dread settling over me. I barely slept, my mind racing with thoughts of Craig and his strange behavior. Early the next morning, I heard a commotion downstairs. I rushed down to find Jeff arguing with Craig. Jeff's face was red with anger, his fists clenched. "What's going on?" I asked, stepping between them. Jeff pointed at Craig. He tried to steal my wallet. I found him in my room going through my stuff. Craig backed away, his hands raised defensively. "I wasn't stealing anything. I was just looking for my phone." Paul and the others came down, drawn by the noise. It took a while to calm Jeff down, but Craig insisted he was innocent. The tension in the room was palpable. No one knew what to believe. We decided to cut the weekend short. Jeff was too upset to stay, and the rest of us felt uncomfortable with Greg around. As we packed our things, I kept a close eye on Greg, worried about what he might do next. On the drive back, Jeff confided in me. I don't know how he got invited. I didn't send him an invitation. He just showed up, saying he knew about the party from work. A chill ran down my spine. Craig had somehow infiltrated our group, and none of us had thought to question it. We decided to call the police when we got back to the city. That evening, we gathered at Jeff's apartment, waiting for the police to arrive. We went through our phones and emails, trying to find any trace of Craig's connection to Jeff. There was nothing. The police took our statements, and they started an investigation. They told us that Craig might be using a false identity, and that he could be dangerous. It was a sobering realization. Days passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept my doors locked and my phone close. One night, I received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was cold and menacing. "Stay out of this," it said, "or you'll regret it." I reported the call to the police, but there was little they could do without more information. My friends and I stayed in close contact, sharing any strange occurrences. We were all on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. One afternoon, Paul called me in a panic. He had seen Craig near his office, watching him from across the street. We decided to meet at a local bar, somewhere public where we could talk safely. We huddled in a corner booth, discussing our options. Jeff suggested hiring a private investigator to find out who Craig really was. It was expensive, but we pooled our money and agreed it was worth it for our peace of mind. The investigator worked quickly, and within a week, he had information for us. Craig wasn't his real name. He was a con artist with a long history of identity theft and fraud. He had likely targeted Jeff because of his upcoming wedding, looking for a way to exploit him financially. Armed with this information, we went back to the police. They issued a warrant for Craig's arrest and advised us to stay vigilant. It was a relief to know the truth, but the fear lingered. Craig was finally caught trying to leave the state. The police found fake IDs and stolen credit cards in his possession. He was arrested and charged with multiple crimes. The nightmare was over, but the scars remained. We never found out exactly how Craig had learned about the party or what his ultimate plan was. But we were grateful to have each other and to have uncovered the truth before it was too late. The experience brought us closer together, a bond forged in fear and resilience. We vowed to always be more cautious and to protect each other from harm. Jeff's wedding went off without a hitch, a celebration of love and friendship that had survived a terrifying ordeal. In the end, we learned that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, and that the strength of true friends can overcome even the darkest of threats. I was house sitting for my friend Emily in her beautiful suburban home while she was on vacation. It was a quiet neighborhood, and I was looking forward to a peaceful week. The house was cozy, with large windows that let in plenty of sunlight during the day. At night, it was just me and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. On the third day, around mid-afternoon, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before opening the door. Through the peephole, I saw a man in a delivery uniform holding a package. He seemed normal enough, but something about him made me uneasy. I cracked the door open, keeping the chain lock in place. "Can I help you?" I asked. "Package for Emily," he said, smiling. He held up a small box with a plain brown wrapper. "Emily isn't here right now," I replied. "You can leave it on the porch." He frowned, shifting his weight. I need a signature. I glanced at the package. There was no label or company logo. My suspicion grew. I'm not comfortable signing for someone else's package. Can you come back another time? His smile faded, replaced by an annoyed look. Look, lady, I just need a signature. It'll only take a second. Something about his tone sent a chill down my spine. I shut the door and locked it. I'll call Emily and let her know you were here. You can try again later. There was silence on the other side. I waited, my heart pounding. Suddenly, the door handle jiggled. I stepped back, fear gripping me. I'm calling the police. I shouted. The jiggling stopped, and I heard footsteps retreating. I peeked through the window and saw the man walking away quickly, glancing back at the house. I grabbed my phone and called Emily. There was a guy here claiming to have a package for you, I said when she answered. Emily sounded confused. I didn't order anything. Are you okay? I think he was trying to get inside, I whispered, still watching the street. The man was gone, but my unease remained. I'm scared, Emily. Call the police, she said. And make sure all the doors and windows are locked. I'll try to get back as soon as I can. I hung up and dialed 911. The operator assured me that officers would be there soon. I went around the house, double-checking the locks on all the windows and doors. Every creak and groan of the house made me jump. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a patrol car outside. 2 officers approached the door, and I let them in, feeling a wave of relief. I explained what had happened, and they took my statement. They searched the area but didn't find anyone matching the description I gave them. They advised me to stay vigilant and assured me they would patrol the neighborhood more frequently. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every noise seemed amplified, every shadow sinister. As night fell, I turned on all the lights and kept my phone close. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside. It sounded like someone was trying to open a window. My heart raced as I crept towards the sound. The curtains rustled slightly, and I caught a glimpse of movement outside. I dialed 911 again, my hands shaking. He's back, I whispered to the operator. Stay on the line, she said. Officers are on their way. I heard a soft thud, followed by the sound of glass cracking. He was trying to break in. I grabbed a kitchen knife and hid in the pantry, praying the police would arrive in time. The minutes dragged on, each second an eternity. I heard footsteps inside the house, slow and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. He was inside. The footsteps grew closer. I could see his shadow through the crack in the pantry door. I held my breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The front door burst open, and I heard shouting. The police were here. The man's footsteps retreated quickly, and I heard a scuffle. Moments later, an officer called out, "It's safe now. You can come out." I emerged from the pantry, shaking. The police had the man in handcuffs. He glared at me with cold, dark eyes as they led him away. The officers assured me that he would be charged and that I was safe now. Emily came back the next day, cutting her trip short. We hugged tightly, both of us shaken by the experience. She thanked me for protecting her home and for my quick thinking. The police later told us that the man was a known criminal who had been targeting houses in the area. He used the delivery guys to gain entry and rob them. If I hadn't been cautious, who knows what could have happened. The experience left me wary and anxious, but it also made me more aware of my surroundings. I learned to trust my instincts and to take any unusual behavior seriously. Even now, I still get nervous when the doorbell rings unexpectedly, but I know I can handle it. After all, I survived a terrifying encounter and came out stronger on the other side. The plane dropped me off in the Alaskan wilderness, a vast, untouched land. I was here for a solo photography trip, aiming to capture the raw beauty of the remote landscapes and wildlife. It was a dream trip, one I'd planned for years. Armed with my camera gear and a sense of adventure, I felt ready for anything. The first few days were blissful. I trekked through dense forests, climbed rocky hills, and marveled at the stunning vistas. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an eagle. At night, I set up camp and slept under a canopy of stars, feeling a deep connection to nature. On the fourth day, I ventured further from my base camp, eager to explore a new area. The weather was clear, and I made good progress. Around midday, I heard a series of loud cracks echoing through the trees. Curious, I followed the sound, thinking it might be wildlife. As I got closer, the noises became clearer, gunshots. My excitement turned to caution. Poaching was a problem in these parts, and I didn't want to stumble into something dangerous. I moved silently, using the thick foliage for cover, until I reached a clearing. To my horror, I saw a group of men loading a freshly killed bear into the back of a truck. They were armed, and their expressions were hard and menacing. I snapped a few photos from a safe distance, my heart pounding. This was clear evidence of illegal activity. Suddenly, one of them looked in my direction. I froze, hoping the dense underbrush would hide me, but it was too late. "Hey! Who's there?" he shouted. The others turned, guns at the ready. I backed away slowly, then turned and ran. The sounds of pursuit were immediate, branches snapping, voices shouting. My heart raced as I navigated the unfamiliar terrain, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. I stumbled upon a small stream and followed it, hoping it would mask my trail. The cold water soaked my boots, but I kept going. The adrenaline coursing through my veins kept me moving despite the fear gripping me. Hours passed, and the sounds of pursuit faded. Exhausted, I stopped to catch my breath and assess my situation. I was lost, deep in the wilderness with poachers on my trail. My only hope was to find my way back to the base camp and radio for help. As night fell, the temperature dropped. I made a small fire for warmth but kept it low to avoid drawing attention. The darkness was absolute, and every sound made me jump. I barely slept, my mind racing with thoughts of what might happen if they found me. At dawn, I resumed my journey. My only guide was the distant memory of the terrain I'd crossed. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig, sent waves of fear through me. I knew they were still out there, searching. By midday, I spotted movement ahead, a lone figure. My heart sank as I realized it was one of the poachers, scanning the area with binoculars. I ducked behind a tree, praying he hadn't seen me. The next few hours were a game of cat and mouse. I moved slowly and carefully, avoiding open areas and sticking to dense cover. My stomach growled, but I dared not stop for long. The fear of being caught kept me going. I stumbled upon a small cave as dusk approached. It was well hidden and offered shelter for the night. I crawled inside, wrapping myself in my jacket for warmth. My body ached, and the hunger gnawed at me, but I was too scared to sleep. Morning light filtered into the cave, and I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. I needed to find my way back to the base camp and alert the authorities about the poachers. Gathering my strength, I set out again, moving as quickly as I dared. As I crested a hill, I saw the smoke from my abandoned campfire in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The sound of footsteps behind me made me freeze. They had found me. I ran, my legs burning with effort. I could hear them closing in, shouting to each other. Desperation fueled my sprint, and I burst into the clearing where my camp was. I grabbed the radio, fumbling with the controls. "Mayday, mayday. This is an emergency." I shouted into the receiver. "I'm being pursued by armed poachers." Coordinates. I gave my location, hoping someone would hear me. Gunshots rang out, and I dove behind a tree. The poachers were close, too close. The radio crackled to life. "We're sending help. Hold tight." The next moments were a blur of fear and chaos. I kept low, moving between trees, trying to stay out of sight. The sound of a helicopter grew louder, and I felt a flicker of hope. The poachers shouted in anger, realizing their time was up. The helicopter hovered overhead, and I waved frantically. Moments later, armed park rangers descended, weapons drawn. The poachers tried to flee but were quickly apprehended. I collapsed in relief as the rangers approached. They helped me to my feet and escorted me to the helicopter. As we lifted off, I looked down at the wilderness below, my heart still racing. Back at the ranger station, I gave my statement and handed over the photos. The authorities assured me the poachers would face justice. I was safe now, but the ordeal had left its mark. The wilderness, once a place of peace and beauty, had become a landscape of fear and survival. I had faced danger and lived to tell the tale, but I knew I would never forget the terror of those days. It was a quiet night at the mall, or so I thought. As the night security guard, I was used to the stillness, the empty hallways echoing my footsteps. The stores were all closed, and the only light came from the emergency signs and my flashlight. It was nearing midnight, and I was doing my usual rounds, checking each entrance and exit to make sure everything was locked up tight. I was halfway through my shift when I noticed something strange. The door to one of the service corridors was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it earlier. My heart started to race as I approached it cautiously, my flashlight beam trembling slightly. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the dark corridor. The air was stale and cold. I scanned the area, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to close the door, I heard a faint noise, a whisper, maybe, or the rustle of clothing. I wasn't alone. I turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, listening intently. The sound was coming from the main atrium, a soft shuffle, like footsteps. I peeked around the corner and saw shadows moving in the dim light. A group of men, dressed in dark clothing and wearing masks, were making their way towards the jewelry store. My heart pounded as I realized what was happening. Thieves. They had broken in, and I was the only one who could stop them. I pulled out my radio and whispered into it, "This is Officer Davis. We have a break-in at the mall. I need immediate assistance." The radio crackled, but there was no response. The signal must have been too weak inside the building. I needed a plan. The mall was vast, with countless stores and hidden corners. I knew it better than anyone, and that knowledge was my only advantage. I decided to head towards the security office where I could access the mall surveillance system and call for help from the landline. Staying low, I moved through the service corridors, avoiding the main hallways where the thieves were. Every creak of the floorboards and every distant noise made me jump. The fear was almost paralyzing, but I had to keep going. I reached the security office and quickly locked the door behind me. The monitors flickered to life, showing various parts of the mall. The thieves were split into two groups, one heading towards the electronics store and the other to the jewelry store. I picked up the phone and dialed 911. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Finally, an operator answered. 911, what's your emergency? This is Officer Davis, security at the Westfield Mall. We have a break-in. There are multiple intruders, and I need immediate assistance. I rattled off the address and my location in the mall. Help is on the way, the operator assured me. I hung up, but I knew it would take at least 10 minutes for the police to arrive. I watched the monitors, my mind racing. The thieves were getting closer to the stores. I couldn't let them get away with it. I decided to use the mall's PA system to try and scare them off. I turned on the microphone and spoke in the calmest voice I could muster. This is mall security. The police have been notified and are on their way. Leave the premises immediately. I watched as the thieves froze, looking around in confusion. For a moment, I thought it had worked. But then one of them shouted, "Find her. She's got to be in the security office." Panic surged through me. I had to move. I grabbed my flashlight and slipped out of the office, locking the door behind me. The chase was on. I could hear their footsteps echoing through the halls, getting closer. I moved quickly and quietly through the back corridors, trying to stay one step ahead. I found myself in the food court, hiding behind a row of tables. I could see their shadows moving, searching for me. I needed a distraction. I grabbed a metal tray from one of the tables and threw it across the room. It clattered loudly, and the thieves immediately headed towards the sound. Taking advantage of the diversion, I slipped into a nearby store and hid behind a clothing rack. The store was dark, and I could barely see. I crouched low, my breathing shallow, listening for any sign of them. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Then, I heard them again, closer this time. I crawled towards the back of the store, hoping to find another exit. The emergency exit was just a few feet away. I made a dash for it, praying it wouldn't be locked. To my relief, it swung open, and I slipped through, finding myself in another service corridor. I was closer to the main entrance now. If I could reach it, I might be able to get outside and meet the police. I moved quickly but cautiously, every shadow and noise putting me on edge. As I rounded a corner, I came face to face with one of the thieves. He was as surprised as I was, and for a moment, we both froze. Then he lunged at me. I dodged, but he grabbed my arm, pulling me towards him. I fought back, kicking and punching, desperate to break free. In the struggle, I managed to grab my flashlight and swung it at his head. He stumbled back, dazed. I didn't wait for him to recover. I ran. I could hear him shouting to the others, but I didn't look back. I burst through another set of doors and found myself in the main atrium, near the entrance. The exit was just ahead, and through the glass doors, I could see the flashing lights of police cars. Relief washed over me as I sprinted towards the doors. The police were already entering the building, weapons drawn. I shouted and waved, and they quickly surrounded me, ushering me to safety. The thieves were caught within minutes, their escape routes cut off by the police. I watched as they were handcuffed and led away, my heart still pounding from the adrenaline. The police took my statement, and I showed them the security footage. It was over. I was safe, and the mall was secure once more. But the fear and the tension of that night stayed with me, a stark reminder of how quickly things can change. As the sun began to rise, I finally allowed myself to relax. The mall, now empty and quiet again, felt different. It had been a place of routine and boredom, but that night it had become a battleground. I knew I would never look at it the same way again. It was a chilly Halloween night, and the mansion loomed ominously against the backdrop of the darkened sky. The air was thick with anticipation and the scent of autumn leaves. As I stepped through the ornate doors into the grand foyer, I was immediately engulfed by the lively chatter and laughter of the partygoers. The mansion had a rich history, rumored to be haunted, but tonight it was filled with revelers in elaborate costumes, dancing to the haunting melodies echoing through the halls. I had come to the party with a group of friends, but soon found myself wandering alone through the maze-like corridors of the mansion. The atmosphere was festive, yet there was an underlying tension that I couldn't quite shake off. As I passed by a partially open door, I caught fragments of a conversation, a hushed discussion about spiking drinks and stealing valuables from the guests. My heart skipped a beat as I realized the seriousness of what I had just overheard. Someone was planning to drug and rob the unsuspecting partygoers. Panic surged through me as I struggled with what to do next. Should I confront them directly? Or find a way to warn everyone without alerting the perpetrators? I decided to gather more information first, to be sure of what I had heard. I quietly slipped into the shadows, following the voices down a dimly lit hallway. Peeking around a corner, I saw two figures, their faces obscured by masks, discussing their plans in hushed tones. They were definitely up to something sinister. I needed to act quickly. My mind raced with possibilities as I tried to formulate a plan. I couldn't risk being caught eavesdropping, but I had to find a way to warn the guests. I quietly retreated from my hiding spot and made my way back towards the main hall where the party was in full swing. As I walked through the crowd, I noticed the hosts of the party, a wealthy couple known for their extravagant events. They were mingling with the guests, oblivious to the danger lurking in their own mansion. I approached cautiously, trying to blend in while keeping an eye out for the suspicious individuals I had seen earlier. Just as I was about to approach the hosts, a loud crash echoed through the mansion. The chandelier in the main hall suddenly flickered and swayed ominously, drawing everyone's attention. It seemed like the perfect distraction. I took a deep breath and approached the hosts discreetly. "Excuse me," I began, trying to keep my voice steady amidst the chaos of the party. "I overheard something concerning. I think there are people here who are planning to drug and rob the guests." The hosts looked at me in disbelief, their faces paling under their masks. "Are you sure?" the woman asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," I replied urgently. "I heard them talking about it. We need to do something before it's too late." The hosts quickly gathered a few trusted friends and security personnel. They discreetly began to escort guests out of the mansion, explaining that there was an emergency and urging everyone to leave calmly. The music was turned off, and the atmosphere shifted from jovial to tense in an instant. As the guests filed out, I kept a watchful eye, hoping to catch a glimpse of the suspects. But they seemed to have vanished into thin air. Panic gnawed at my insides as I wondered if they had managed to slip away unnoticed. Had I acted too late? Were they still hiding somewhere in the mansion, waiting to carry out their plan? Just then, a commotion erupted at the back of the hall. Two masked figures were trying to force their way past the remaining security guards. One of them pulled out a small vial from his pocket, confirming my worst fears. They were indeed the culprits. I sprang into action, shouting for the guards to stop them. Chaos ensued as the guards wrestled with the intruders, trying to restrain them. The vial fell from the man's hand, shattering on the marble floor. The liquid inside emitted a noxious odor, confirming its dangerous contents. The guests who had not yet left began to panic, rushing towards the exits. The mansion was plunged into darkness as the lights flickered and went out completely. In the confusion, I lost sight of the suspects, but I knew they couldn't have gotten far. With the mansion now shrouded in darkness, I cautiously made my way through the hallways, my heart pounding with every step. The sound of footsteps echoed around me, blending with the frantic whispers of the remaining guests. I strained my ears, trying to locate the source of the noise. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my shoulder from behind. I whirled around, ready to defend myself, but it was one of the security guards. "They're gone," he said breathlessly. "We couldn't catch them." Fear washed over me as I realized the danger was not over. The suspects were still on the loose, and they knew I had heard their plans. I had to get out of the mansion and find help before it was too late. Together with the security guard, we made our way towards the nearest exit. The mansion was eerily quiet now, the party abandoned and the lights still out. We moved cautiously, checking every corner for any sign of the suspects. As we reached the front door, I glanced back at the mansion one last time. The grandeur and opulence seemed to mock the horror that had unfolded inside its walls. I vowed never to return, the memory of that Halloween night forever etched in my mind. Outside, the police had arrived, alerted by the guests who had managed to escape. I quickly explained what had happened, emphasizing the danger posed by the suspects. The officers sprang into action, organizing a search of the surrounding area in an attempt to apprehend them. Hours passed as we waited anxiously for news. The mansion was cordoned off, and forensic teams combed through the scene for evidence. Eventually, word came that the suspects had been apprehended trying to flee the area in a stolen vehicle. Relief washed over me as I heard the news. The danger had passed, and justice would be served. I thanked the police and the hosts of the party, grateful that no one had been seriously harmed. I was on a long road trip through the Midwest, trying to get to a friend's wedding. The drive was taking longer than I expected, so I decided to stop for the night at a small, isolated motel I found just off the highway. It looked run down, but I was too tired to care. I checked in with a guy at the front desk who barely looked at me. He handed me a key and told me my room was around the back. The room was what you'd expect for the price. It was old, smelled a bit musty, and the bed creaked when I sat on it. I set my bag down, took a quick shower, and then collapsed onto the bed. I was exhausted, so I fell asleep almost immediately. Sometime in the middle of the night, I thought I heard something outside my door. It sounded like someone was trying to open it. I got up and looked through the peephole, but I couldn't see anything. I figured it was just my imagination or maybe the wind. I went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. When I woke up the next morning, I felt groggy. I got dressed and went outside to get to my car, but it wasn't where I had parked it. Panic set in. I ran around the lot, thinking maybe I had parked it somewhere else, but it was gone. I went back to my room, and that's when I noticed my bag was missing too. My wallet, my phone, everything was in there. I went to the front desk to report the theft. The same guy was there, but he acted like he didn't remember me checking in. He said he didn't see anything and that it was probably my fault for not locking my car. I knew I had locked it, though. The more I talked to him, the more hostile he became. He said there was nothing he could do and told me to leave. Without my car and my belongings, I was stranded. I went back to my room, trying to figure out what to do next. There was no one else around. It felt like I was the only guest at the motel. I decided to walk down the road to see if I could find help, but as I walked, I felt like I was being watched. I saw an old payphone near the edge of the property and tried to use it, but it was broken. When I turned around, I saw the guy from the front desk watching me from the doorway of the office. He had a strange look on his face, almost like he was enjoying my desperation. I went back to my room, feeling hopeless. I tried to think of a plan, but without my phone or any way to contact someone, I was stuck. I heard footsteps outside again and decided to see who it was. When I opened the door, I saw two men standing there, both of them looking rough and unfriendly. They told me they were there to help, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. I backed away, trying to close the door, but one of them shoved it open and pushed me back into the room. They started going through my things, even though there wasn't much left to take. They found my car keys, which I had left on the nightstand, and one of them pocketed them with a grin. I tried to leave, but the other man blocked my way. They told me I wasn't going anywhere until I paid them for helping me. I had nothing to give them, and they knew it. They started arguing with each other, and I took the chance to slip past them and run out the door. I ran down the road, not looking back. I could hear them yelling, but I kept going. After what felt like hours, I saw a small diner up ahead. I burst through the doors, out of breath, and told the people inside what had happened. They looked at me with a mix of pity and disbelief, but called the police for me. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They went to the motel, but by the time they got there, the place was empty. The guy at the front desk and the two men were gone. They found my car hidden behind the motel, but everything inside it was gone. My belongings were never found. The police took me to the station where I could finally call my family. They helped me get back on my feet, but the whole experience left me shaken. I couldn't believe how quickly things had gone wrong and how vulnerable I had been. I still think about that night sometimes. The feeling of being watched, the hostility of the motel staff, and the terror of realizing I was stranded with no help in sight. It's made me more cautious, especially when traveling alone. I decided to sell my motorcycle. It wasn't anything fancy, but I needed the money. I put up an ad on Craigslist and waited. It didn't take long for someone to respond. His name was Mike, and he seemed like a nice enough guy. We exchanged a few emails, and he agreed to come over and take a look. Mike showed up right on time. He was a tall guy with a friendly smile. We chatted a bit about the bike, and he seemed genuinely interested. After a short test ride, he agreed to buy it. He handed me the cash, and I gave him the keys and the title. Everything seemed fine, and I was relieved the sale went smoothly. A few days later, I started getting strange texts from Mike. He said the bike wasn't running properly and accused me of selling him a lemon. I apologized and told him it had always worked fine for me. He didn't seem satisfied and kept sending messages. The tone of his texts got angrier, and he started accusing me of scamming him. I tried to ignore the texts, hoping he would give up. But then I started noticing a car parked outside my apartment building. It was there every night, and I had a gut feeling it was Mike. One evening, as I was walking home from work, I saw the car again. This time, I saw Mike sitting inside, staring right at me. My heart raced, and I quickly went inside, locking the door behind me. The texts from Mike continued, becoming more threatening. He said he knew where I lived and that he would make me pay. I decided to call the police. They took my report but said there wasn't much they could do unless he actually did something. That didn't make me feel any safer. The next night, I heard noises outside my window. I peeked through the blinds and saw Mike in my yard, looking around. I called the police again, and this time they arrived quickly. They found Mike in my yard and questioned him. He claimed he was just there to talk to me about the bike. The police warned him to stay away from me and let him go. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. The following evening, I came home to find my front door slightly open. My stomach dropped. I cautiously stepped inside and saw that my place had been trashed. Drawers were pulled out, papers scattered everywhere. I called the police again, and they came to investigate. I told them about Mike, but they couldn't find any evidence linking him to the break-in. I was terrified. I couldn't stay there anymore, so I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend. For the next few days, I lived in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't hear from Mike, and the car outside my apartment was gone. I started to relax, thinking maybe he had given up. One night, while staying in my friend's place, I woke up to a noise outside the window. I crept over and looked out. There was Mike, staring right at me. I felt a wave of panic. I woke my friend, and we called the police. They arrived quickly and caught Mike trying to break in. This time, they arrested him. Mike was charged with stalking and attempted burglary. I had to testify in court, which was terrifying, but I was relieved when he was sentenced to jail time. After the trial, I moved to a new apartment and changed my phone number. It took a while, but I finally started to feel safe again. Looking back, I can't believe how quickly things escalated. I never expected selling a motorcycle could lead to something so terrifying. I've learned to be more cautious with transactions like that and to trust my instincts if something feels off. I parked my van in a remote spot in the backwoods of Louisiana, hoping for a quiet night. The area was thick with trees and underbrush, and the nearest town was miles away. I was on a break from work, looking to enjoy some solitude. The forest was dense and silent, with only the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the stillness. After setting up camp, I cooked a simple dinner on my portable stove and settled in for the evening. The air was cool, and the sky was clear. As darkness fell, I locked the doors of my van, feeling secure in my isolation. I read for a while, the silence of the forest wrapping around me like a blanket. It must have been close to midnight when I first heard the sound. It was a distant, muffled noise, like something heavy moving through the trees. I dismissed it as an animal, but my nerves were on edge. I continued reading, but the noise grew louder, closer. I turned off my light and listened, my heart pounding. Voices, low and rough, tarried on the wind. They were getting nearer. I peered out the small window, straining to see through the darkness. Figures moved in the shadows, carrying rifles. My blood ran cold. Poachers, I thought, hoping they wouldn't notice me. Suddenly, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping over the trees and landing on my van. Panic surged through me. I ducked down, hoping they hadn't seen me. The voices grew louder, and I could make out words now. Over here. Looks like a camp. My breath caught in my throat. I heard footsteps approaching, crunching on the gravel. I had to do something. Grabbing my keys, I considered driving away, but the fear of making noise and drawing attention stopped me. Check it out. Maybe it's a game warden, one of the men said, his voice closer now. I realized with horror they thought I was there to bust them. The door handle rattled, and I held my breath. Locked, one of them grunted. We need to find out who's inside. I had to act fast. I quietly climbed into the driver's seat, keys in hand, and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed it into reverse, backing away from the men. Shouts erupted as they realized I was escaping. Gunshots rang out, and a bullet shattered the rear window. I floored the gas, heart pounding, as I sped down the dirt road. The van bounced and jolted over the uneven terrain, but I didn't dare slow down. In the rearview mirror, I saw headlights. They were following me. I took a sharp turn, hoping to lose them in the maze of back roads. The van skidded, tires struggling for grip, but I managed to stay on the road. The headlights were still there, getting closer. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to focus. I remembered a narrow trail I had passed earlier, barely wide enough for the van. I swerved onto it, branches scraping the sides, and the headlights behind me swerved too. They were relentless. The trail twisted and turned, and I fought to keep control. Suddenly, the trees opened up, and I found myself on the edge of a steep hill. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. The truck behind me wasn't as lucky. It barreled out of the trees and crashed into the side of my van, sending us both over the edge. The world spun as we tumbled down the hill. The van rolled, glass shattering and metal crunching. I was thrown around, every impact sending pain through my body. Finally, we came to a stop at the bottom. The silence was deafening. Dazed, I crawled out of the wreckage. My body ached, but I could move. I had to get away before they found me. I stumbled through the trees, trying to put as much distance between myself and the crash as possible. Voices echoed in the distance, angry and frantic. They were searching for me. I kept moving, ignoring the pain and exhaustion. The forest was a maze, but I hoped to find a road or some sign of civilization. Hours passed. The night seemed endless, and I was losing hope. Then, in the faint light of dawn, I saw a cabin. It looked abandoned, but it was shelter. I forced myself to the door and found it unlocked. Inside, it was dark and musty, but safe. I collapsed on the floor, too exhausted to move. I listened for any sounds of pursuit, but heard nothing. I had made it. I was safe, for now. When the sun rose, I ventured out, cautious and wary. I needed to find help. After hours of walking, I stumbled upon a road and flagged down a passing car. The driver took one look at me and called the police. It took a while to explain what happened, but they eventually believed me. The poachers were caught, their operation shut down. I was treated for my injuries and given a ride back to town. The experience left me shaken and wary of the wilderness. I still love the solitude and beauty of nature, but I'm more cautious now. I decided to hike the Appalachian Trail alone, hoping to find some peace and clear my mind. The trail had always been on my bucket list, and I finally had the time. I packed my gear, left a detailed itinerary with a friend, and set off early one morning. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the simple pleasure of being in nature. On the fourth day, the weather turned. Dark clouds gathered, and a heavy rain began to fall. I pushed through, determined to reach the next shelter. As I was walking, I heard voices up ahead. At first, I thought it was other hikers, but as I got closer, I realized the voices were harsh and angry. I slowed down, my curiosity piqued. The voices were coming from a small clearing off the trail. I crept closer, staying behind the cover of the trees. Peering through the branches, I saw a group of men. They were heavily armed and seemed to be arguing. My heart pounded as I realized they weren't hikers. One of the men saw me before I could back away. He shouted, and in an instant, they all turned toward me. I tried to run, but they were too fast. Two of them tackled me to the ground, their grip rough and unforgiving. They dragged me into the clearing, and I could see the fear in their eyes. "Who are you?" one of them demanded, shoving me against a tree. I stammered out my name, trying to explain that I was just a hiker, but they didn't believe me. They searched my backpack, pulling out my map and my phone. One of them, who seemed to be the leader, examined my ID and then looked at me with suspicion. "He's just a hiker," he said, but his tone was unsure. "But he knows we're here now." I tried to explain that I wouldn't tell anyone, that I would just keep hiking, but they didn't trust me. They tied my hands behind my back and forced me to sit down. The leader, a man with a scar running down his cheek, began to discuss what to do with me. The others wanted to get rid of me, but he seemed hesitant. Hours passed. I sat there, cold and wet, listening to their arguments. They talked about a robbery gone wrong and how they were hiding out until things cooled down. They were clearly desperate and scared, which made them even more dangerous. As night fell, they set up a small campfire. The leader finally decided they would keep me until they could figure out a safe way to let me go. They took shifts watching me, their guns always within reach. I barely slept, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. Early the next morning, they decided to move. They untied my feet but kept my hands bound. We walked for hours, deeper into the forest. My legs ached, and I stumbled several times, but they kept pushing me forward. I tried to memorize the path, hoping for a chance to escape. That chance came when one of the men, who was watching me closely, slipped on a wet rock and fell, twisting his ankle. The others were distracted, helping him up. I saw my opportunity and took it, running as fast as I could. My hands were still tied, making it difficult to keep my balance, but adrenaline fueled me. I heard them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. Finally, I found a small cave and hid inside, trying to catch my breath. I could hear them searching for me, their voices growing fainter. I waited until I was sure they were gone, then cautiously emerged. I managed to find a sharp rock and used it to cut the ropes around my wrists. My hands were numb, but the relief was immense. I knew I had to keep moving, so I found my bearings and headed in the opposite direction of where they had gone. For hours, I trekked through the forest, fear driving me forward. I had no idea if they were still looking for me or if they had given up, but I couldn't take any chances. By nightfall, I found a small stream and followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. The next day, I finally stumbled upon a ranger station. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and covered in cuts and bruises. The rangers were shocked to see me and immediately called for help. I told them everything, and they assured me I was safe now. They took me to a nearby town, where I gave a full report to the police. The men were eventually caught, their hideout discovered thanks to my information. It took me a long time to recover from the ordeal, both physically and mentally. I agreed to house sit for a friend in the Hamptons. It was a huge mansion, isolated from the rest of the town, surrounded by woods. I thought it would be a relaxing break from my routine. The house had everything you could ask for, a pool, a huge kitchen, and even a home theater. It seemed like the perfect getaway. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent my time lounging by the pool, reading, and exploring the house. It was a bit too quiet at times, but I enjoyed the solitude. Every night, I made sure to lock all the doors and windows. The house was so big, it took almost 15 minutes to do a full check. On the third night, I was woken up by a noise. It sounded like something scratching against the wall. I brushed it off as an animal outside and went back to sleep. The next morning, I found the back door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it the night before. I checked the house but didn't find anything missing or out of place. That night, I double-checked every door and window before going to bed. I lay awake for a while, listening for any sounds. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the same scratching noise, this time coming from downstairs. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed down the stairs, using the flashlight to guide my way. The noise led me to the kitchen. I scanned the room with the flashlight and saw nothing unusual. As I turned to leave, I heard a creak from the pantry. I slowly opened the door, and nothing was there. Feeling a bit foolish, I went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, I found footprints in the mudroom. They weren't mine. Panic set in. Someone had been in the house. I called my friend to ask if anyone else had access to the house, but she assured me that no one should be there. She suggested I call the police, but I hesitated. What would I say? I had no proof other than my own fear. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, sitting in the living room with all the lights on. Around midnight, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. I heard footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. I whispered to the operator, explaining that someone was in the house. She told me to stay on the line and hide. I crept into the small closet under the stairs, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps came closer, and I could hear someone moving around in the living room. The operator stayed on the line, reassuring me that help was on the way. Minutes felt like hours. I heard the intruder moving through the house, opening doors and drawers. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The footsteps stopped, and there was silence. I waited, holding my breath, until I heard the police call out. They found me in the closet and escorted me outside. They searched the house but didn't find anyone. However, they did find signs of forced entry at the back door. Whoever it was had been watching me, waiting for the right moment. The police advised me to stay somewhere else, but I didn't have many options. My friend arranged for a security company to come and install cameras and alarms the next day. I spent the night at a nearby hotel, unable to sleep, replaying the events in my mind. The rest of my time in the Hamptons was uneventful, but I never felt safe again in that house. Every creaking shadow made me jump. When my friend returned, she thanked me and apologized for what happened. I was relieved to leave and promised myself I'd never house sit in such an isolated place again. Looking back, I'm just glad I trusted my instincts and called for help. It could have ended much worse. That summer taught me to always be cautious, no matter how safe a place might seem. I was driving through the Rockies during a snowstorm, trying to make it to my delivery spot before the weather got any worse. The snow was coming down heavy, and the roads were getting slick. It was late, and there were hardly any other vehicles on the road. Just me and my thoughts, the radio on low to keep me company. Suddenly, I saw a man on the side of the road, waving his arms. His car was parked haphazardly with the hood up. He looked desperate, and I couldn't just drive past him in this weather. I pulled over, rolled down my window, and asked if he needed help. He told me his car had broken down and he needed a ride to the nearest town. I hesitated for a moment but then unlocked the passenger door. He climbed in, shaking the snow off his coat and thanking me profusely. He looked normal enough, middle-aged, a bit rough around the edges, but who wouldn't be in this weather? We started driving, and he made small talk, asking where I was headed and how long I'd been on the road. Something about him felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I chalked it up to the stress of the storm and focused on the road ahead. After a few miles, his demeanor changed. He got quiet and started looking around the cab, almost like he was casing the place. My nerves were on edge, and I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Then, out of nowhere, he lunged at me, grabbing the wheel and trying to steer us off the road. I fought back, wrestling for control of the truck. He was yelling something about needing my truck and how he couldn't let me ruin his plans. Panic surged through me as I realized this wasn't just a desperate man, He was dangerous. I managed to elbow him in the ribs, causing him to lose his grip on the wheel. I hit the brakes, skidding to a stop on the icy road. We were both breathing hard, and I knew I had only seconds before he tried something else. I reached for the door handle, but he was quicker, pulling a knife from his coat and pointing it at me. "Get out," he ordered, his voice cold and steady. "Now!" I raised my hands, trying to show I wasn't a threat, and slowly got out of the cab. The snow was falling harder, the wind whipping it into my face. He got out too, keeping the knife trained on me as he moved towards the driver's seat. As he climbed in, I saw my chance. I grabbed the door and slammed it on his leg, making him howl in pain and drop the knife. I kicked it away and yanked the door open, dragging him out and throwing him into the snow. He scrambled to get up, but I was already back in the truck, locking the doors. I started the engine and floored it, the tires spinning for a moment before finding traction. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the middle of the road, shouting and waving his arms, but I didn't slow down. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop now. I drove for what felt like hours, not daring to pull over or slow down. Eventually, I saw the lights of a small town up ahead. Relief washed over me as I pulled into a gas station and parked under the bright lights. I got out, shaking, and ran inside to call the police. The cops arrived quickly, and I told them everything. They took my statement and assured me they'd search for the man. I stayed at the station for a while, trying to calm down and collect myself. The snowstorm was still raging outside, but I felt a little safer knowing I wasn't alone anymore. Eventually, I got back in my truck and continued my journey, the fear slowly fading but never completely gone. I kept replaying the events in my head, wondering how close I had come to real danger. The snowstorm finally eased up, and the roads cleared as I made my way out of the mountains. I never saw the man again, and I don't know if the police ever caught him. But every time I drive through a storm now, I can't help but feel a twinge of fear, remembering that night in the Rockies. We planned a camping trip to a spot in California we'd heard about from some friends. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend away from everything. There were 4 of us, me, my boyfriend Mike, and our friends Lisa and Tom. We set up our tents in a nice clearing, surrounded by trees, not too far from a small creek. It seemed perfect. The first night was great. We cooked over the campfire, told stories, and laughed a lot. The next day, we went for a hike and swam in the creek. By the time we got back to the campsite, we were tired but happy. We settled in for another night by the fire, enjoying the peace and quiet. Late that evening, we noticed a faint smell of smoke. At first, we didn't think much of it. Maybe someone else had a campfire nearby. But then the smell got stronger, and we started to see a haze in the air. Mike climbed a small hill to get a better look and came back with bad news. There was a wildfire not too far from us, and the wind was blowing it our way. Panic set in fast. We grabbed our stuff, but we couldn't pack everything. We took what we could carry and left the rest. The path back to the parking area was narrow and rocky, and it was hard to move quickly. The smoke got thicker, making it hard to see and breathe. We could hear the fire crackling in the distance, getting closer. As we hurried along the trail, we came across a group of people. They didn't look like campers. They had backpacks, but they weren't carrying camping gear. They had guns. My heart sank. We were trapped between the fire and these strangers. One of the men stepped forward and told us to hand over our backpacks. I could see the desperation in his eyes. These weren't just looters, they were people trying to survive, just like us. But they had the upper hand. We didn't have a choice. We handed over our packs, hoping they would let us go. But then another man noticed Lisa's necklace, and things got worse. They started arguing among themselves, giving us a chance to run. We didn't wait. We bolted down the trail, leaving our stuff behind. The smoke was thicker now, making it hard to breathe. I could hear the fire roaring behind us, and the heat was intense. We stumbled and fell, but we kept moving. I could hear the looters shouting behind us, but they were getting drowned out by the noise of the fire. We reached a small ravine and climbed down, hoping it would offer some protection. The air was a bit clearer there, and we stopped to catch our breath. Mike checked to make sure everyone was okay. We were all shaken, but no one was hurt. We decided to follow the ravine, hoping it would lead us to safety. The ground was uneven, and it was hard to move quickly. We could hear the fire getting closer, and the sky was a strange orange color. The heat was unbearable, and we were all coughing from the smoke. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a small stream. We followed it, hoping it would lead us to a larger body of water or a road. The smoke was starting to thin out, and we could see a bit more clearly. We kept moving, even though we were exhausted. We eventually came to a clearing and saw a dirt road. Relief washed over us. We followed the road, hoping to find help. After a while, we heard the sound of engines. 2 trucks appeared, driven by firefighters. They stopped when they saw us and helped us into the trucks. They gave us water and checked us for injuries. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the fire raging in the distance. The firefighters took us to a safe area where we were checked by medics and given food and blankets. We told them about the looters, and they said they'd report it to the authorities. That night, we stayed in a shelter set up for evacuees. It was a stark contrast to the peaceful campsite we did just the night before. The experience had shaken us all. We were grateful to be safe, but also worried about what we had left behind and the people we had encountered. We never found out what happened to the looters. The police took our statements and said they would investigate. The wildfire was eventually contained, but it took days. We lost most of our gear, but that didn't matter compared to what could have happened. That trip changed us. We were more cautious about where we camped and always kept an eye on the weather and fire reports. The memory of that fire and the fear we felt stayed with us. We were lucky to get out alive, and we knew it. From then on, we made sure to be better prepared and more aware of our surroundings. Camping was still something we enjoyed, but we never forgot how quickly things could go wrong. The wilderness could be beautiful, but it could also be deadly. That experience taught us to respect it and to always be ready for the unexpected. It was a typical night shift at the psychiatric hospital, and I was going about my duties as usual. The hospital was quiet, patients were mostly asleep, and everything seemed normal. But then, I heard it, a strange, eerie noise coming from one of the closed-off wings of the hospital. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just the building settling or the wind blowing outside. But the noise persisted, growing louder and more unsettling with each passing moment. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, sending shivers down my spine. Curiosity got the better of me, and I knew I had to investigate. I made my way down the dimly lit hallway, the sound growing louder with each step I took. As I reached the closed-off wing, I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what I would find on the other side. But I couldn't let fear hold me back, so I pushed open the door and stepped inside. What I saw inside the wing sent chills down my spine. There, huddled in the corner of the room, was a former patient, someone who had been discharged months ago. I couldn't believe my eyes. How had this patient managed to sneak back into the hospital unnoticed? And why were they hiding out in this closed-off wing? But as I approached, I realized something was terribly wrong. The patient was muttering to themselves, their eyes wild with fear and paranoia. They were dangerously delusional, lost in a world of their own making. I knew I had to act fast. I couldn't let this patient harm themselves or anyone else. But I also knew that approaching them could be dangerous. They were unpredictable, and I had no way of knowing how they would react. With a deep breath, I slowly approached the patient, keeping my movements calm and steady. I tried to reassure them that everything was going to be okay, but they didn't seem to hear me. Suddenly, the patient lunged at me, their hands reaching out with surprising strength. I barely had time to react, dodging out of the way just in time to avoid their grasp. My heart was pounding in my chest as I backed away, trying to think of what to do next. I knew I needed to get help, but the hospital was deserted at this time of night, and I was on my own. But then, I remembered the emergency call button on my radio. With shaking hands, I pressed the button and called for backup, hoping that someone would hear my call and come to my aid. Seconds felt like hours as I waited for help to arrive. I could hear the patient behind me, still muttering to themselves and growing more agitated by the second. Finally, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and relief flooded through me as two security guards burst into the room. Together, we were able to restrain the patient and get them the help they so desperately needed. As the patient was taken away by medical staff, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude wash over me. I had faced danger head-on and come out the other side unscathed. But as I made my way back to my station, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. This encounter had been a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked within the walls of the psychiatric hospital, dangers that I would never forget. I'm a wildlife biologist, spending my days studying animal behavior in the secluded depths of the forest. It's a solitary job, but I thrive on the challenge of unraveling the mysteries of nature. On one particular expedition, I found myself deep in the heart of the forest, observing a pack of wolves as they hunted their prey. But as I watched from my hidden vantage point, I noticed something strange. The wolves were exhibiting aggressive behavior unlike anything I had ever seen before. At first, I chalked it up to natural instincts, but as I continued to observe, I realized that there was something more going on. The wolves seemed to be working together with a sense of purpose, as if they were being controlled by some unseen force. Intrigued, I decided to investigate further, determined to uncover the truth behind their strange behavior. But as I ventured deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I stumbled upon a clearing in the trees, a clearing that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. In the center of the clearing stood a group of people, their faces obscured by masks as they chanted in a language I didn't understand. I watched in horror as the wolves gathered around them, their eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. It was like something out of a nightmare, a twisted ritual that seemed to bind the wolves to the will of their human masters. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was in grave danger. I knew I had to get out of there before the wolves and their mysterious handlers noticed me. With trembling hands, I backed away from the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I had just witnessed. But before I could escape, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. I turned to see a group of masked figures emerging from the trees, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I had to get out of there, to escape before they caught up to me, and I became their next victim. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon. I could hear the wolves howling in the distance, their voices echoing through the forest like a chorus of doom. But even as I fled, I knew that I couldn't outrun them forever. I needed to find a way to outsmart them, to use my knowledge of the forest to my advantage. With every step, I searched for a way out, my senses on high alert as I navigated the treacherous terrain. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through me as I raced against time to escape the relentless pursuit of the wolves and their sinister handlers. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I caught sight of a narrow passageway up ahead, a glimmer of light shining through the darkness like a beacon of hope. With renewed determination, I pushed myself towards it, ignoring the pain and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm me. And then, finally, I burst through the surface and into the open air, gasping for breath as I emerged from the depths of the forest. I collapsed onto the ground, exhausted and shaken, but alive. I was out camping with my friends in the Australian outback, enjoying the vast wilderness and the freedom it offered. We had set up our tents in a remote area, far from civilization, where we could truly immerse ourselves in nature. One evening, as we were sitting around the campfire, we heard voices approaching from the distance. At first, we didn't think much of it. After all, it wasn't uncommon for other campers to pass through the area. But as the voices got closer, we realized that something wasn't right. The people approaching our campsite didn't sound like your typical campers. Their voices were low and gruff, and they were speaking in a language we couldn't understand. We exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. Should we approach them and see what they wanted? Or should we stay hidden and hope they passed by without noticing us? Before we could make a decision, the strangers emerged from the trees and into the clearing where our campsite was located. There were 4 of them, rough-looking men with weather-beaten faces and suspicious eyes. They greeted us with forced smiles and introduced themselves as fellow campers who had lost their way in the wilderness. They seemed friendly enough, but there was something about them that put us on edge. We offered them some food and water, hoping to be hospitable and diffuse the tension. But as they ate, they started asking us strange questions about our supplies, our weapons, and whether we were alone out here in the wilderness. Alarm bells started ringing in my head. These guys weren't just lost campers, they were sizing us up, trying to figure out if we were an easy target. I exchanged worried glances with my friends, silently communicating our growing unease. We needed to get out of here, and fast, before things took a turn for the worse. But before we could make a move, one of the strangers stood up and pulled a knife from his belt. He grinned at us, his eyes glinting with malice, and said something in a language we didn't understand. That was all the confirmation we needed. These guys weren't lost campers, they were dangerous criminals, and we were in serious trouble. We scrambled to our feet, ready to make a run for it, but the strangers were faster. They surrounded us, blocking our escape routes and brandishing their weapons menacingly. I felt a surge of fear coursing through my veins. We were outnumbered and outgunned, with nowhere to run and no one to help us. But we refused to give up without a fight. We banded together, our hearts pounding in our chests, and prepared to defend ourselves against whatever these strangers had planned. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife as we faced off against each other, neither side willing to back down. It was a standoff, a battle of wills in the middle of the Australian outback. But just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, we heard the sound of approaching footsteps from the distance. It was the sound of rescue, of salvation, of someone coming to save us from our terrifying predicament. We held our breath as the footsteps drew closer, praying that it wasn't too late, that help had arrived in time to save us from the clutches of these dangerous strangers. And then, emerging from the trees and into the clearing, came a group of park rangers, their faces grim and determined. They had been alerted to our situation by a passing hiker who had seen the commotion from a distance. With the arrival of the park rangers, the tables were turned. The strangers, realizing they were outnumbered, dropped their weapons and surrendered without a fight. We were safe. We were alive. And as we were escorted back to civilization by the park rangers, we breathed a sigh of relief, grateful to have escaped from our terrifying ordeal in the Australian outback. I'm a wildlife photographer, always chasing that perfect shot of elusive creatures in the great outdoors. So when I heard about the opportunity to capture images of the wildlife in the vast wilderness of Alaska, I jumped at the chance. Armed with my camera and a sense of adventure, I set out on a road trip through the frozen landscape, eager to capture the beauty of nature in its purest form. But as I ventured deeper into the wilderness, I started to feel a sense of unease creeping over me. The vast expanse of snow-covered land seemed to stretch on forever, and it was easy to lose your bearings in such an unforgiving environment. I tried to push aside my fears and focus on my mission, but the feeling of being watched never quite left me. It was like there was something out there, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing out there but the wind and the snow. But deep down, I knew there was something more sinister at play. And then, one night as I made camp in a remote clearing, I heard it. A low growl echoing through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was just a wolf or a bear passing through, but the sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was like whatever was out there was calling to me, beckoning me into the darkness. I tried to ignore it and focus on getting some rest, but sleep eluded me that night. Every sound seemed magnified, every shadow filled with unseen dangers. And then, just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the edge of the clearing, filled with a hunger that sent a chill down my spine. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared back at those eyes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then, without warning, the creature lunged forward, its massive form barreling towards me with a speed and ferocity that took my breath away. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I fled through the snow-covered forest. But no matter how fast I ran, the creature was always right behind me, its heavy footsteps echoing through the trees. I tried to shake it off, to lose it in the dense undergrowth, but it was relentless. It was like it was toying with me, drawing out the chase for its own twisted amusement. I pushed myself to the limit, my lungs burning with exertion as I raced through the wilderness. But just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw it. The road, stretching out before me like a lifeline in the darkness. With one final burst of energy, I sprinted towards it, the creature hot on my heels. But just as it seemed like all hope was lost, I saw the lights of a passing car up ahead. I screamed for help, waving my arms frantically as the car drew closer. And then, mercifully, it stopped, the driver jumping out to help me just as the creature closed in behind me. I collapsed into their arms, gasping for breath as they helped me into the safety of their car. And as we drove away into the night, leaving the creature far behind us, I knew that I had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that the creature is still out there, waiting for its next victim in the vast wilderness of Alaska. And I can only hope that whoever comes after me is better prepared to face the horrors that lurk in the darkness. I was in my apartment, alone, during a citywide blackout caused by a raging storm. The darkness was suffocating, enveloping everything in its thick embrace. The only sound was the howling wind outside, rattling the windows and sending shivers down my spine. Suddenly, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to break in. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in terror, not knowing what to do. Panic surged through me as I realized I was completely vulnerable in the darkness. I had to think fast, to find a way to protect myself from whoever was trying to get inside. My mind raced with fear, trying to come up with a plan, but all I could think about was the impending danger. I groped around in the darkness, searching desperately for something, anything, that I could use as a weapon. My hands closed around a heavy lamp, and I clutched it tightly, ready to defend myself if the intruder managed to break through the door. The pounding on the door grew louder and more frantic, and I could hear the sound of splintering wood as they tried to force their way in. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt like I was going to be sick with fear. But then, suddenly, the pounding stopped, and there was nothing but silence. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. It was as if the intruder had vanished into thin air. I stood there in the darkness, trembling with fear, unsure of what to do next. Should I call the police? Should I try to find a way out of the apartment? I didn't know, and the uncertainty only made my fear worse. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the pounding started again, louder and more ferocious than before. My blood ran cold as I realized that whatever was on the other side of that door was not going to give up easily. I backed away from the door, clutching the lamp tightly in my trembling hands. I felt like a cornered animal, trapped and helpless in the face of impending danger. But then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard the sound of voices outside. Relief flooded through me as I realized that help had finally arrived. The police had come to rescue me from whatever nightmare I had found myself in. I rushed to the door, throwing it open and stumbling out into the hallway. The police were there, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like beacons of hope. They quickly subdued the intruder, leading them away in handcuffs. I stood there in the hallway, shaking with relief, grateful to be alive. It was over, the nightmare was finally over, and I was safe once again. But the memory of that night would stay with me forever, a constant reminder of the terrifying darkness that lurks just beyond the edges of our everyday lives. I found myself driving along the winding coastal roads of Oregon, seeking a quiet retreat from the hustle and bustle of city life. The motel I stumbled upon seemed perfect, an unassuming building nestled between the towering pines and overlooking the rugged coastline. The owner, Mr. Johnson, greeted me warmly as I checked in, his smile friendly yet slightly unnerving. The room was quaint and cozy, adorned with nautical decor that matched the seaside charm. I unpacked my bags and settled in, enjoying the peaceful sound of waves crashing against the shore. Mr. Johnson was attentive, offering suggestions for local sites to explore and even bringing me a complimentary bottle of wine that evening. But as the days passed, I started noticing peculiarities. Mr. Johnson would linger a little too long during our conversations, asking personal questions that made me uneasy. He seemed overly interested in my plans and whereabouts, almost as if he was keeping track of my every move. One afternoon, while exploring the motel grounds, I stumbled upon a shed at the back of the property. It was locked, but through a gap in the boards, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a collection of photographs and small objects. Curiosity piqued, I made a mental note to investigate further. That night, unable to shake off my unease, I decided to take a closer look. I waited until Mr. Johnson retired to his living quarters and then quietly made my way to the shed. With a bit of effort, I managed to pry open the lock and step inside. What I found sent chills down my spine. The shed was filled with photographs, faces of guests I had seen around the motel, including mine. Each photograph was accompanied by a small item, a hairbrush, a piece of jewelry, even a worn-out shoe. It dawned on me that these were Mr. Johnson's trophies, mementos he had collected from his guests. Fear gripped me as I realized the extent of his obsession. I hastily snapped a few pictures with my phone as evidence, my hands trembling with disbelief. Just as I was about to leave, I heard footsteps approaching. Panic surged through me as I realized Mr. Johnson must have discovered my intrusion. I barely had time to hide behind a stack of crates when he entered the shed, a flashlight in hand. His expression was cold and calculating, a stark contrast to the friendly demeanor he had shown me earlier. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the open lock, and then began muttering to himself. Heart pounding, I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find me. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for him to leave. Finally, he turned and walked out, locking the shed behind him. I waited a few more agonizing moments before daring to move. I made my way back to my room in a daze, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I knew I had to leave immediately, but I couldn't risk confronting Mr. Johnson again. I hastily packed my belongings, leaving behind anything that might slow me down. As I reached the parking lot, I noticed Mr. Johnson standing near the reception area, his gaze fixed on the shed. I knew he must have suspected someone had been there. With my heart in my throat, I quietly slipped into my car and started the engine, praying he wouldn't notice me. I drove away as quickly as I could, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. The coastal scenery that had seemed so serene only days before now felt ominous and threatening. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I booked a room in a busy hotel, surrounded by other guests and far away from Mr. Johnson's motel. I reported the incident to the local authorities, showing them the photographs I had taken as proof. They assured me they would investigate, but warned that without concrete evidence of criminal activity, their hands were tied. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Johnson had been watching me, even from afar. In the days that followed, I couldn't sleep properly, haunted by the realization of how close I had come to becoming one of Mr. Johnson's trophies. I kept imagining what might have happened if he had caught me in the shed. The thought sent shivers down my spine. Months passed, and eventually, I learned from a news report that Mr. Johnson had been arrested on unrelated charges. They found evidence linking him to a string of burglaries in the area, but there was no mention of his disturbing collection of trophies. I tried to put the ordeal behind me, but the memory of that coastal Oregon motel and its sinister owner still lingers. I was babysitting for the Buckinghams one Friday night. They had a nice house in a quiet suburb, and their son, Tommy, was always well behaved. It was supposed to be an easy job: put Tommy to bed, watch some TV, and get paid. I had no idea how wrong I was. Tommy was already in his pajamas when I arrived. Mrs. Buckingham gave me the usual rundown. Tommy's bedtime is at 8:30. Snacks are in the kitchen. Call if you need anything. They left, and it was just me and Tommy. We played a few games, and then I let him watch some cartoons while I scrolled through my phone. Everything seemed normal until I noticed Tommy kept glancing at the door. I asked him if something was wrong, and he just shook his head. I didn't think much of it at the time. After dinner, I told Tommy it was time to get ready for bed. He protested a bit but eventually went upstairs. I tucked him in, read him a story, and he fell asleep pretty quickly. I went back downstairs and settled on the couch, ready for a quiet evening. Around 9 p.m., I heard a noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like whispering. I thought Tommy might be talking in his sleep, so I went to check on him. When I opened his door, I saw the glow of a screen under his blanket. He had a tablet. "Tommy, what are you doing?" "It's bedtime," I said, pulling the blanket off. He looked scared and tried to hide the tablet. "I'm sorry," he said. "I was just talking to my friend." I took the tablet from him and saw a chat window open. The messages were from someone named Mike. My heart sank when I read the messages. They were asking Tommy about his house, who was with him, and if the babysitter was pretty. The last message sent chills down my spine. "I'm coming to visit." I immediately shut off the tablet and asked Tommy how he knew this Mike. He told me he met him online while playing games. I told Tommy to stay in his room and lock the door. I went downstairs and called the police, explaining everything to them. They said they'd send someone over right away. While I waited, I locked all the doors and windows. I kept peeking outside, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. The minutes felt like hours. I was scared but tried to stay calm for Tommy's sake. Then, there was a knock at the door. It was soft at first, then more insistent. I looked through the peephole but saw nothing. My heart was pounding. I backed away from the door, my mind racing with fear. Another knock, louder this time. Then, a voice. "Hey, I know you're in there. Open up." It was a man's voice, deep and threatening. I grabbed a kitchen knife and hid behind the couch, praying the police would arrive soon. The knocking turned into banging. "Open the door, or I'll break it down," the voice yelled. I could hear the doorknob rattling, and the door creaking under the pressure. I clutched the knife tighter, my hands shaking. Just when I thought the door would give in, I heard sirens in the distance. The banging stopped, and I peeked out from behind the couch. The man was gone. The police arrived a few moments later, and I ran to open the door for them. I told the officers everything. They checked the house and the surroundings but didn't find anyone. They took the tablet as evidence and assured me they would investigate. I called the Buckinghams and explained what happened. They rushed home, terrified and grateful that Tommy and I were safe. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump. I kept thinking about how easily it could have gone differently. The police never caught the guy, but they did trace the messages back to a known predator. The Buckinghams were more careful with Tommy's online activities after that, and I decided to stick to babysitting during the day. The experience left me shaken. I still babysit, but I'm much more cautious now. I always keep an eye on what the kids are doing online and make sure all the doors are locked. Out in the dense wilderness of the Florida Everglades, my friend and I thought we had found the perfect spot for some stealth camping. It seemed like the ideal escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, a chance to reconnect with nature and each other. Little did we know, our peaceful getaway would soon turn into a nightmare. As the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness descended upon the swampy landscape, we settled down in our makeshift campsite, surrounded by the sounds of nocturnal creatures and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. But as the night wore on, a sense of unease began to creep over us, a feeling that we were not alone in the wilderness. It started with distant noises, faint whispers, and the occasional splash of water in the darkness. At first, we dismissed them as the normal sounds of the Everglades, but as they grew closer and more insistent, we began to realize that something was not right. Then, out of the darkness, emerged a figure, tall and imposing, moving with a stealthy grace that sent shivers down our spines. He approached our campsite with purpose, his eyes glinting in the dim light of our campfire, and we knew in an instant that he was not someone to be trifled with. He introduced himself as a smuggler, using the vast expanse of the Everglades to hide his illicit activities from prying eyes. He warned us to stay out of his way, threatening dire consequences if we dared to interfere with his operations. We were frozen with fear, unsure of what to do next. Should we try to reason with him? Or should we make a run for it and hope to escape his clutches? Our minds raced with possibilities as we weighed our options, but in the end, we knew that we were no match for this dangerous man and his criminal enterprise. As the smuggler loomed over us, his presence casting a dark shadow over our campsite, we realized that we had no choice but to comply with his demands. We watched helplessly as he went about his business, moving with a ruthless efficiency that left us feeling powerless and vulnerable. But even as we cowered in fear, a small spark of defiance flickered within us. We refused to let this man intimidate us, to rob us of our freedom and our dignity. And so, when the opportunity presented itself, we seized it with both hands, mustering all of our courage and strength to confront our tormentor head-on. In a moment of desperation, we made a run for it, tearing through the dense underbrush of the Everglades with the smuggler hot on our heels. Adrenaline coursed through our veins as we raced through the darkness, our hearts pounding with fear and determination. But just when it seemed like all hope was lost, we stumbled upon a hidden path, leading us to safety and salvation. With renewed energy and resolve, we pushed forward, putting as much distance between us and our pursuer as possible. And then, finally, we saw it, the faint glow of civilization on the horizon, a beacon of hope in the darkness. With one final burst of speed, we sprinted towards it, our lungs burning and our muscles aching, until at last, we reached the safety of civilization. As we collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath and shaking with exhaustion, we knew that we had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. But even as we celebrated our victory, we couldn't shake the feeling that the smuggler was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next opportunity to strike. And so, as we made our way back to civilization, we vowed to never return to the Everglades again, to put this harrowing ordeal behind us and move on with our lives. I had been looking forward to my fishing trip in the Alaskan wilderness for months. I needed a break from my hectic life, and there was something about the isolation and the challenge that appealed to me. I packed my gear, loaded up my truck, and drove out to a remote spot I had found on a map. It was miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest and icy rivers. The first few days were perfect. The air was crisp, the scenery was stunning, and I had the river all to myself. I spent my days fishing and my nights by the campfire, listening to the sounds of the wilderness. I felt completely at peace. On the fourth day, I was fishing along a particularly quiet stretch of the river when I had the strange feeling that I was being watched. I looked around but saw nothing unusual. Just trees and the river flowing by. I shrugged it off and kept fishing, but the feeling stayed with me. Later that evening, as I was cooking my dinner over the fire, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, but then I caught a glimpse of movement. Someone was out there. I called out, thinking maybe it was a lost hiker, but there was no answer. The rustling stopped, and everything went quiet again. I tried to shake off the unease and went to bed, but I had trouble sleeping. Every little noise seemed amplified, and I kept imagining someone lurking just beyond the light of my campfire. In the morning, I found fresh footprints around my campsite. They weren't mine. Someone had been here during the night, watching me. I decided to move my camp further up the river, hoping to get away from whoever was out there. I packed up my gear and hiked for a couple of hours until I found a new spot that seemed more secluded. I set up camp again and tried to put the previous night out of my mind. But the feeling of being watched returned. As I fished, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there. That evening, I heard the rustling again, closer this time. I shone my flashlight into the trees and saw a figure dart behind a tree. It was a man, dirty and unkempt, with wild eyes. He looked like he had been living out here for a long time. I called out to him, asking if he needed help, but he just stared at me from behind the tree, not saying a word. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about his gaze was unnerving. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight on him, and went back to my camp. I didn't sleep at all that night, keeping my fire burning bright and my knife close at hand. In the morning, the man was gone, but his footprints were all around my camp. I decided it was time to leave. I packed up my gear and started hiking back towards my truck. The whole way, I felt like I was being followed. I kept hearing twigs snapping and leaves rustling, but every time I turned around, I saw nothing. As I neared the spot where I had parked my truck, I saw the man again, standing in the middle of the path. He was holding a crude spear and had a crazed look in his eyes. I stopped, my heart pounding. He took a step towards me, raising the spear. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the cuts and scrapes I was getting from the branches. I could hear him chasing after me, his footsteps getting closer. I stumbled and fell, rolling down a small hill. I landed hard, the wind knocked out of me, but I scrambled to my feet and kept running. I finally burst out onto the dirt road where my truck was parked. I jumped in, locking the doors behind me. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking, and started the engine. As I sped away, I saw the man emerge from the trees, watching me with those wild eyes. I drove for hours until I reached the nearest town. I reported the encounter to the local authorities, but they didn't seem too concerned. They said there were a few hermits living out in the wilderness, but they usually kept to themselves. I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. That trip changed me. I used to love the idea of solitude and the wilderness, but now I can't shake the memory of those eyes watching me from the darkness. I was driving through the mountains of Colorado when the storm hit. The sky turned dark and rain started pouring down in heavy sheets. I could barely see the road in front of me. I had a GPS, but it kept losing signal. I needed to get to my cabin before nightfall, so I decided to take a shortcut I saw on the map. The shortcut was a narrow, winding road that seemed to go on forever. The rain made it slippery and dangerous, but I pushed on, hoping it would save me time. The trees on either side were thick and tall, blocking out what little light was left. It felt like I was driving into a tunnel of darkness. Suddenly, my car hit something, and I skidded to a stop. I got out to check and saw a fallen tree blocking the road. The rain was relentless, and I was drenched within seconds. There was no way around it, and I couldn't move the tree by myself. I was stranded. I decided to wait out the storm in the car, hoping someone would come by. I got back in, locked the doors, and tried to calm down. Hours passed, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. My phone had no signal, and the battery was running low. I felt completely isolated. As night fell, the rain finally started to ease. The darkness outside was complete, and the only light came from my car's interior. I was about to try and get some sleep when I saw movement outside. My heart skipped a beat. Someone was out there, watching me. I strained to see through the rain-streaked windows, but could only make out a vague shape. It seemed to be moving closer. Panic set in, and I started the car, hoping to at least turn on the headlights to see better. The car wouldn't start. The battery was dead. The figure outside moved closer, and I could see it was a man. He was tall and wearing a dark coat, his face hidden in the shadows. He stopped a few feet from the car and just stood there, staring at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use the flashlight as a weapon if needed. The man started tapping on the window, slowly at first, then harder. The sound was unnerving in the silence. I tried to shout at him to go away, but my voice was shaky and weak. He leaned closer to the window, and I could see his face. It was pale and twisted into a malicious grin. He mouthed something, but I couldn't make it out. I locked eyes with him, my mind racing with fear. I had to get out of there. I grabbed the door handle on the passenger side and threw it open, running into the dark forest. The rain had turned to a light drizzle, but the ground was muddy and difficult to navigate. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy and determined. I ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees were thick, and I kept tripping over roots and branches. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stop. I glanced back and saw his silhouette moving quickly, getting closer. I stumbled into a clearing and saw a small cabin in the distance. It was dark, but it was my only hope. I sprinted towards it, praying the door would be open. I reached it and turned the handle. It was unlocked. I rushed inside and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. The cabin was old and dusty, with minimal furniture. I found a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, hoping it would hold. I tried to catch my breath, listening for any sign of a man. The only sound was the rain and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Minutes passed, then an hour. I started to relax, thinking maybe I had lost him. But then I heard it. The slow, deliberate sound of footsteps on the porch. He had found me. My heart raced again, and I looked around for something to defend myself with. There was an old fireplace poker in the corner. I grabbed it and stood ready. The doorknob rattled, and the door creaked as he pushed against it. The chair held, but I knew it wouldn't for long. He started pounding on the door, the wood splintering under the force. I backed away, holding the poker tightly, my hands shaking. The door burst open, and he stepped inside, his eyes locking onto mine. He didn't say a word, just smiled that same twisted smile. I swung the poker, but he caught it, wrenching it from my hands. He threw it aside and advanced on me. I backed into a corner, trapped. He reached out, and I closed my eyes, expecting the worst. Suddenly, I heard a shout from outside. The man turned, and I saw headlights through the broken door. Another car had pulled up, and someone was yelling. The man hesitated, then turned and ran out the back of the cabin. I stayed frozen in place until a man and woman entered, their flashlights sweeping the room. They saw me and rushed over, asking if I was okay. I could barely speak, just nodded. They called the police, and I finally felt a sense of relief wash over me. The authorities arrived and took my statement, but the man was long gone. They promised to search the area, but I knew he was already far away. I never found out who he was or why he was out there. I just knew I was lucky to be alive. That night changed me forever. I never take shortcuts, and I always make sure my car is in perfect condition before any trip. The memory of his twisted smile still haunts me, but I know I'll never let my guard down again. I was on a solo road trip, taking my time to see the country. One evening, I decided to stop at a small motel off the highway. It looked decent enough, and I was tired of driving. After checking in, I noticed a small diner next to the motel. I was hungry, so I went in to get something to eat. The diner was nearly empty, just a couple of truckers and an old couple in a corner booth. The cook was a middle-aged man with a gruff look. He greeted me with a forced smile and handed me a menu. I ordered a burger and fries, and a coffee to keep me awake for the drive the next day. While I waited for my food, I noticed the cook watching me from the kitchen. It made me uncomfortable, but I figured he was just bored. When my food arrived, I dug in. The burger tasted a bit off, but I was too hungry to care. I finished my meal and went back to my room. About an hour later, I started feeling sick. My stomach was cramping, and I felt nauseous. I thought maybe it was just food poisoning, something that would pass. But the pain kept getting worse. I was sweating and shaking, and my vision was getting blurry. I tried to call the front desk, but there was no answer. I decided to go down to the lobby to get help. When I opened the door, the hallway seemed to stretch forever. I could barely keep my balance as I walked. I finally made it to the lobby, but it was empty. I stumbled outside, hoping to find anyone who could help me. The cook was standing by the diner's entrance, smoking a cigarette. When he saw me, he walked over with that same forced smile. I told him I felt really sick and needed help. His smile faded, and he looked almost annoyed. He said it was probably just something I ate and that I should go back to my room and rest. He offered to bring me some water. I was desperate, so I agreed. I went back to my room, and he followed me with a bottle of water. He watched as I took a sip, then laughed. I tried to rest, but the pain was unbearable. My mind was racing. Something wasn't right. Why was the cook so indifferent? Why was there no one at the front desk? I decided I needed to leave, to find a hospital or something. I grabbed my keys and stumbled out to my car. As I started the engine, I saw the cook watching me from the diner. He had a strange look on his face, almost like he was enjoying my pain. I put the car in gear and sped out of the parking lot. The dizziness made it hard to drive, but I had to get away. I managed to find a gas station a few miles down the road. I stumbled inside and begged the cashier to call an ambulance. I collapsed on the floor, the room spinning around me. The last thing I remember was the sound of sirens getting closer. I woke up in a hospital bed. The nurse told me I had been poisoned. The police wanted to talk to me. I told them everything about the motel, the diner, the cook. They looked concerned and left the room to make some calls. Later, a detective came in and told me they had arrested the cook. He had a history of poisoning guests, but they could never prove it until now. They found evidence in the diner's kitchen, enough to put him away for a long time. I was relieved, but the experience left me shaken. I couldn't believe how close I came to dying. The thought of that cook watching me suffer still haunts me. Now, I'm much more careful about where I eat and stay when I travel. The open road doesn't seem as inviting as it once did. I'm the keeper of a lighthouse, and let me tell you about the scariest night of my life. It was during a storm, one of those really bad ones that rattles the windows and shakes the whole building. I was up in the tower, doing my usual rounds and keeping an eye on the sea. That's when I saw it, a shipwrecked sailor clinging to a piece of driftwood, desperately trying to stay afloat in the churning waters. My heart went out to him, knowing that he was in serious trouble out there. So I did what any decent person would do. I let him in. I guided him up to the lighthouse, trying to be a good Samaritan and offer him shelter from the storm. But as soon as he stepped inside, I knew that something was wrong. There was something about him, something in his eyes that set off alarm bells in my head. He was hostile from the start, demanding food and shelter like he owned the place. I tried to reason with him, to tell him that I was just trying to help. But he wasn't having any of it, getting more aggressive by the minute. I knew I had to do something, to protect myself and the lighthouse from this dangerous man. So I tried to reason with him, to calm him down and get him to see reason. But he wasn't interested in listening, too caught up in his own anger and frustration. That's when he made his move, lunging at me with a knife in his hand. I barely had time to react, dodging out of the way and trying to defend myself as best as I could. It was like something out of a nightmare, like I was trapped in some kind of horror movie. I managed to grab hold of a nearby lamp and swing it at him, knocking him off balance and giving me enough time to make a run for it. I didn't stop running until I was miles away from the lighthouse, until I was sure that he couldn't follow me anymore. I called for help as soon as I could, telling them what had happened and begging them to come and get me. It felt like hours before they finally arrived, like I was trapped in some kind of endless nightmare. But eventually they found me, and they took me back to safety. I never found out what happened to that sailor, whether they caught him or whether he managed to slip away into the night. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that night for as long as I live. It was the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, and it's something that I hope I never have to experience again. I was out on a solitary fishing expedition in the open sea, just me and the endless expanse of water stretching out in every direction. The fog was thick that day, rolling in from the horizon and shrouding everything in a dense mist. As I navigated through the fog, I spotted something looming in the distance. It was a ship, drifting aimlessly on the waves. At first, I thought maybe it was just another fishing vessel, lost in the fog like me. But as I got closer, I realized something was off. There was no movement on deck, no sign of life anywhere aboard the ship. It was like a ghost ship, abandoned in the middle of the ocean. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached cautiously, unsure of what I would find. I called out, but there was no response, just the sound of the waves lapping against the hull. I tied up my boat and climbed aboard, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay, like something had died out there on the water. I searched the ship from top to bottom, but there was no sign of the crew. It was like they had vanished into thin air. I felt a growing sense of unease as I realized that I was alone on this abandoned vessel, surrounded by nothing but fog and ocean for miles in every direction. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, telling myself that maybe the crew had abandoned ship in a hurry, or that they had fallen overboard and drifted away in the current. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The way the ship was drifting, aimlessly, with no one at the helm, it was like it was waiting for something. I made my way back to my boat, feeling more anxious than ever. I knew I needed to get out of there, to put as much distance between me and that ghost ship as possible. As I untied the ropes and prepared to leave, I heard a sound coming from below deck. It was faint at first, barely audible over the roar of the waves, but then it grew louder and more distinct. It was laughter. Maniacal, unhinged laughter, echoing through the empty halls of the ship. I froze, my blood running cold as I realized that I wasn't alone after all. There was someone else on board, someone who didn't want me to leave. I scrambled back onto the ship, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched for the source of the laughter. But no matter where I looked, I couldn't find anyone. I felt like I was losing my mind, like the walls of the ship were closing in around me. I knew I needed to get out of there, to escape before whatever was haunting that ship found me. I raced back to my boat, not stopping until I was safely away from that cursed vessel. As I looked back one last time, I saw the fog closing in around it, swallowing it whole. I don't know what I encountered out there on the open sea, and I don't think I ever want to know. I was backpacking through Europe, soaking in the sights and sounds of each new city I visited. But when I reached the mountains, I decided to take a break from civilization and go for a hike. It seemed like a good idea at the time, a chance to reconnect with nature and escape the crowds. I set out early in the morning, following a trail that wound its way through the dense forest. The air was crisp and cool, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in dappled patterns. It was peaceful, almost serene. But as I hiked deeper into the mountains, the trail started to become less defined. Trees crowded in on either side, obscuring my view of the surrounding landscape. I pushed on, confident that I could find my way back if I needed to. But then I made a wrong turn, just a small deviation from the path, but enough to send me off course. I didn't realize it at first, too caught up in the beauty of the forest to notice that I was lost. It wasn't until hours later that I started to panic. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I had no idea where I was or which way to go. I tried retracing my steps, but everything looked the same, trees stretching out in every direction, their branches tangled and twisted together. Panic gnawed at my stomach as I realized just how lost I was. I started to walk faster, my heart pounding in my chest. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent me spiraling further into fear. I knew I had to find my way back to the trail before it was too late. But the forest seemed to stretch on forever, its depths unfathomable. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me from every direction. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go on, I saw it, a clearing up ahead, a break in the trees that promised safety and salvation. With renewed determination, I pushed forward, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of the forest. But as I stepped into the clearing, my heart sank. It wasn't the trail that awaited me, but a desolate expanse of rocky terrain, with no signs of civilization in sight. I sank to my knees, tears stinging my eyes as I realized the gravity of my situation. I was truly lost, with no one to help me and no way to find my way back. But even in my darkest moment, I refused to give up. With a shaky breath, I forced myself to stand and keep moving, determined to find my way out of the forest no matter what it took. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard it, the distant sound of voices, calling out through the trees. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled towards the sound, my legs aching and my throat raw with thirst. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go on, I burst through the trees and into the arms of a group of hikers who had been searching for me. They had heard my cries for help and had followed the sound, leading them straight to me. I collapsed into their arms, overcome with gratitude and exhaustion. I had made it out alive, but the memory of those dark woods would haunt me for the rest of my days. I am a backpacker, exploring the rugged coastline in search of adventure and solitude. It's just me, the sound of the crashing waves, and the endless expanse of the sea stretching out before me. But as I hiked along the coastline, I stumbled upon a hidden sea cave nestled in the rocky cliffs. Intrigued, I decided to explore further, eager to see what secrets lay hidden within its depths. As I entered the cave, the air grew cooler and the sound of the waves faded into the distance. I moved deeper into the darkness, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. But then, just when I thought I had seen everything the cave had to offer, I heard the sound of footsteps echoing off the walls. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was now alone. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen for any sign of danger. But the footsteps grew closer, and I knew I had to act fast if I wanted to escape. With trembling hands, I searched for a way out, but the walls of the cave seemed to close in around me, trapping me in their suffocating embrace. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I caught sight of a narrow passageway up ahead, a glimmer of light shining through the darkness like a beacon of hope. With renewed determination, I pushed myself towards it, ignoring the pain and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm me. But as I emerged from the cave and into the open air, relief flooded through me. I collapsed onto the rocky shore, gasping for breath as I looked out at the vast expanse of the sea. I had escaped the clutches of the strange men, but the experience will last in my head forever.